The ground did not look important, and that was its power. Elsenborn Ridge rose gently above the surrounding forests, a stretch of high ground that offered no dramatic skyline, no obvious landmarks, and no sense of destiny. It was cold, exposed, and unremarkable to anyone passing through. But in the winter of 1944, this quiet rise in the Ardennes became one of the most decisive pieces of terrain on the Western Front. And the 2nd Infantry Division was ordered to hold it. When the German offensive erupted, chaos spread quickly through the Ardennes. Units were surprised, roads clogged with retreat and confusion. Fog and snow erased visibility and severed communication. What had been a resting sector collapsed into crisis, and entire formations were pushed backward under pressure they had not prepared to meet. But at Elsenborn Ridge, the line did not move. The 2nd Infantry Division arrived battered, cold, and under strength. But it arrived in time. Instead of retreating further west, it dug in along the high ground and turned terrain into defense. Fields of fire were mapped in freezing winds. Artillery was positioned with care. Infantry occupied shallow foxholes cut into frozen earth that resisted every attempt to dig deeper. This was not a place meant for maneuver. It was a place meant for endurance. German forces attacked repeatedly, throwing armor and infantry uphill into prepared positions. Snow-muffled movement, but artillery did not need visibility. Defensive fire shattered assaults before they could gain momentum. When breakthroughs seemed possible, counterfire sealed them shut. The 2nd Division did not counterattack recklessly. It did not chase success. It absorbed pressure and returned it with precision. As the days passed, the importance of Elsenborn Ridge became unmistakable. German units that failed to break through here were forced to divert south, compressing their own advances and disrupting coordination across the front. Time bled away. Fuel was wasted. Momentum died quietly against stubborn resistance. Conditions were merciless. Temperatures plunged. Supplies arrived sporadically. Sleep came in fragments measured in minutes. Men fought with frozen hands and numb feet. Casualties mounted from artillery, exposure, and exhaustion. And still, the line held, not because it was glamorous, but because it had to. The 2nd Infantry Division became the hinge of the northern shoulder of the Bulge. While chaos reigned elsewhere, this sector remained firm. It denied the enemy access to key road networks. It prevented exploitation. It forced the offensive into narrower, less favorable ground. Elsenborn Ridge did not collapse. And because it did not, the German offensive could not succeed. The division's defense did not produce dramatic breakthroughs or sweeping advances. It produced something far more valuable: time. Time for reserves to move, time for air power to return, time for the offensive to exhaust itself. The history of the 2nd Infantry Division at Elsenborn Ridge is not a story of motion. It is a story of refusal, of holding when retreat was easier, of discipline under isolation, of infantrymen turning cold ground into an immovable line. This was not the place where the Bulge was crushed. It was the place where it was stopped. Before this story goes further, take a moment to notice where you're sitting or standing right now. What's the light like where you are? Bright, dim, or somewhere in between? And what hour has the day settled into around you? Elsenborn Ridge was held through long, frozen stretches where time felt suspended. Let this one breathe at the pace it deserves. This is the story of the 2nd Infantry Division at Elsenborn Ridge, where quiet ground, held without drama, helped decide the fate of the Western Front. December 10th, 1944. A young private first class stepped off a supply truck in the Belgian village of Krinkelt, his boots crunching on frost-covered cobblestones, expecting the rumble of artillery that had followed him since Normandy. Instead, he heard laughter. Men from the 2nd Infantry Division sat on stone walls playing cards, their rifles leaning casually against doorframes like walking sticks at a country fair. Smoke rose from chimneys where Belgian families cooked hot meals for American soldiers, who'd been told this sector was so quiet they might get passes to Paris for Christmas. The private looked east toward Germany, barely 2 miles away, across frozen fields and dark forests, and felt the strange cognitive dissonance of a war that had suddenly gone silent. He didn't know that in less than a week, this peaceful village would become the gateway to one of the most ferocious defensive stands in American military history, or that the unremarkable ridge rising behind him would save thousands of lives he'd never meet. The 2nd Infantry Division had earned this rest, though few of the men saw it that way. Since crawling ashore at Omaha Beach on June 8th, 1944, the division had fought through the Norman hedgerows, where every field became a death trap, then pulverized German fortifications at Brest in a siege that turned medieval castle walls into modern rubble. They had pushed through France and into Belgium, accumulating 7,000 casualties while absorbing 3,000 replacements who learned soldiering not in training camps, but in foxholes under mortar fire. Now, in December, the division held an 18-mile stretch of the Ardennes front that Allied intelligence had designated the Ghost Front, a quiet sector where Green divisions trained and veteran units recovered. The official assessment stated that the dense forests and rough terrain made the area unsuitable for German offensive operations. The Siegfried Line pillboxes across the border sat dark and silent, and their guns unmanned, or so the reports claimed. For soldiers who'd seen friends torn apart in Normandy's Bocage and Brest's fortresses, the Ghost Front felt like a gift they didn't quite trust, but desperately needed. Lieutenant Colonel Daniel gathered his company commanders in a stone barn on December 13th to discuss the division's upcoming offensive operation. They were planning to attack east into Germany, targeting the Rohr River dams that controlled flooding in the path of the Allied advance. Daniel spread maps across a wooden table, still scattered with hay, tracing routes through the Siegfried Line fortifications, with a confidence born from months of successful operations. His officers leaned in, asking questions about artillery support and engineer assets, treating the briefing like a training exercise because nothing in their recent experience suggested the Germans had the strength or will to complicate these plans. Outside, a radio operator transcribed routine intelligence reports mentioning vehicle noises heard across the German border, distant sounds that Belgian civilians attributed to normal troop movements. The reports were filed, assessed, and largely dismissed because they fit no pattern that Allied intelligence recognized as threatening. In the barn's dim light, American officers planned an offensive while across the border. German officers planned something far larger. Elsenborn Ridge rose 3 miles behind Krinkelt and Rocherath, a geological feature so unremarkable that most soldiers couldn't have told you its name. And the ridge gained only 200 feet of elevation above the surrounding countryside, covered in the same mix of evergreen forest and open farmland that characterized the entire region. No castles crowned its summit, no ancient battlefields marked its slopes with historical significance. Military maps showed it as terrain, nothing more, a piece of high ground that controlled road junctions leading west toward the Belgian cities of Malmedy and Spa. Those roads mattered because modern armies moved on roads, and the Ardennes offered few good routes through its forests and ravines. Engineers had surveyed the ridge in November as a potential fallback position, more from thoroughness than expectation, marking fields of fire and artillery positions with the same professional attention they'd give any terrain. But in mid-December, and nobody thought about fallback positions because the American army was moving forward, planning the offensive that would crack the Siegfried Line and pour into Germany's industrial heartland before Christmas. The ridge waited, patient and silent, for the moment when its unremarkable elevation would become the most important terrain in the Ardennes. The division's composition reflected the American military's industrial approach to war. 3 infantry regiments formed the corps, the 9th, 23rd, and 38th, each a combined arms organization of 3 battalions plus supporting weapons companies. Artillery support came from 4 field artillery battalions, equipped with 192 guns ranging from 75mm pack howitzers to 155mm heavy pieces. Engineers, medics, and signal companies and supply units filled out a division that numbered roughly 14,000 men. A small city organized for violence and constantly in motion. The men themselves came from every corner of America. Farm boys from Iowa mixing with city kids from Brooklyn, all welded together by shared suffering and the particular competence that comes from surviving combat. They knew their jobs with the unconscious skill of professionals, could coordinate infantry-artillery teamwork without elaborate planning, and trusted their leaders because those leaders had kept them alive through Normandy and France. This institutional knowledge, this combat-forged competence, would prove more valuable than any weapon in the division's arsenal. To the south, the 99th Infantry Division held positions in the Losheim Gap, a natural corridor through the Ardennes that had served as an invasion route since Roman times. The 99th had arrived in Europe in November, a green division fresh from stateside training, assigned to the quiet Ghost Front, precisely because it was quiet. Their soldiers were young, well-trained in the technical sense, but they'd never experienced the animal terror of artillery bombardment or learned the thousand small lessons that separate training from the combat. The veterans of the 2nd Division sometimes looked south at the 99th's positions, with the sympathetic condescension that experienced soldiers reserve for replacements, remembering their own terrifying introduction to combat at Omaha Beach. Nobody expected the 99th to face serious combat. Their mission was to hold quiet positions, gain experience through patrols and routine operations, and gradually absorb the lessons of war without the trauma of a major battle. This assumption, like so many that December, would prove catastrophically wrong within days. Weather defined life on the Ghost Front as much as enemy action or its absence. Temperatures hovered between 20 and 30 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to make every night in a foxhole a test of endurance, but not yet the killing cold that would come later. Heavy overcast hung over the Ardennes, almost continuously, reducing visibility to a few hundred yards and grounding the Allied aircraft that had dominated European skies since Normandy. The clouds suited the Germans perfectly, negating the Americans' greatest advantage. Yes, though few Allied intelligence officers recognized this as a pattern that might indicate preparation rather than coincidence. Soldiers focused on immediate discomforts, wet boots that never fully dried, the constant need to keep weapons clean in damp conditions, the difficulty of staying warm without fires that might draw enemy artillery. They'd grown accustomed to weather as an enemy more persistent than the Germans, something to be endured rather than defeated. The overcast skies that prevented air reconnaissance also prevented them from seeing the massive buildup occurring in the German forests across the border. December 15th brought no indication that the war was about to explode back into life with a fury that would dwarf anything these veterans had experienced. Morning reports noted nothing unusual, a few artillery shells exchanged across the lines, patrol activity light, German radio traffic at normal levels. An intelligence officer filed a report about increased vehicle noises heard by Belgian civilians near the border, sounds that might indicate troop movements or might simply be normal supply activities. The assessment noted the report, assigned it low priority, and filed it with dozens of other fragmentary pieces of intelligence that collectively suggested something but individually proved nothing. In Krinkelt and Rocherath, soldiers went about the mundane routines of military life in a quiet sector, cleaning weapons, writing letters home, playing cards in buildings still warm from Belgian stoves. Some talked about Christmas, now just 10 days away. I am wondering if the war might pause for the holiday as it had in the first year of the Great War. Others discussed the coming offensive toward the Roer dams, viewing it as one more operation in the long march toward Germany's heart. As darkness fell on December 15th, German artillery crews moved into positions they'd prepared with meticulous care over the preceding weeks. They'd sighted their guns in dense forest, camouflaged against aerial observation that rarely came anyway because of the perpetual overcast. Ammunition had been stockpiled in quantities that strained Germany's collapsing logistics network, prioritized above even fuel for the panzers that would exploit the breakthrough. Forward observers crept to positions offering clear views of American lines, memorizing target coordinates and communication procedures. In command posts deeper in Germany, officers synchronized watches and reviewed plans one final time, knowing that dawn would bring either breakthrough or catastrophe. 1,600 artillery pieces aimed at a front held by 4 American divisions stretched too thin across 88 miles. The Ghost Front was about to become very loud, and the men of the 2nd Infantry Division, sleeping in Belgian barns and basements, had perhaps 6 hours of peace remaining. The private who had arrived on December 10th spent his last quiet evening writing a letter home to Nebraska, describing the peaceful Belgian village and the hope that maybe this sector would stay quiet long enough for him to learn soldiering without the terror he'd heard about from Normandy veterans. He sealed the envelope, left it for the mail clerk, and settled into a sleeping bag in the basement of a stone house. Outside, frost formed on the windows of Krinkelt's buildings, and the forest east toward Germany stood dark and silent under heavy clouds. The ridge behind the village showed no lights, just the dark mass of high ground rising against a darker sky. In 6 hours, the largest German offensive on the Western Front would begin, and this unremarkable piece of Belgian countryside would become ground that mattered. The private slept, warm for perhaps the last time in weeks, while history held its breath and prepared to exhale violence. 5:30 in the morning, December 16th, 1944. The first shell hit before most men in Krinkelt had processed the sound of its approach. The explosion punching through a barn roof and turning sleeping soldiers into casualties before they could reach for weapons. Then the world became noise. 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously across an 85-mile front. A bombardment so intense that men 20 miles behind the lines felt the ground shake beneath their feet. In Krinkelt and Rocherath, in foxholes and basements across the 2nd Division sector, soldiers experienced the terrible mathematics of modern artillery. Each gun firing 4 rounds per minute, each round carrying enough high explosive to kill everything within a 30-foot radius. Thousands of shells arriving every minute in a carefully orchestrated symphony of destruction. The veterans of Normandy, men who thought they'd experienced the worst that war could offer, impressed themselves into frozen earth and stone walls and revised their understanding of terror. The German bombardment employed a technique the Wehrmacht had perfected on the Eastern Front. Searchlights aimed at the low cloud ceiling, their beams bouncing back to create an eerie artificial moonlight that turned the winter darkness into a twilight nightmare. American soldiers, stumbling from buildings or scrambling from foxholes, found themselves moving through a surreal landscape where they could see just well enough to witness their own destruction, but not clearly enough to fight back effectively. Shells burst in the artificial light, their explosions creating stark shadows that danced across snow and stone. The psychological effect was devastating because it added visual horror to the auditory assault, by forcing men to watch the bombardment instead of simply enduring it blind in darkness. German artillery officers had calculated this effect precisely, understanding that breaking the enemy's will mattered as much as destroying his positions. Communications collapsed within minutes. Telephone lines, strung on poles or buried in shallow trenches, snapped under artillery impacts, or simply vibrated apart from the sustained concussion. Radio operators found their equipment overwhelmed by the sheer volume of traffic, as every unit simultaneously tried to report contact, request support, or simply confirm it still existed. A radio operator in a battalion command post later described trying to transmit a coherent report while shells landed close enough to throw dirt through the doorway, his voice competing with explosions, screaming, all and the frantic calls of a dozen other operators on the same frequency. Orders went out, but never arrived. Requests for information went unanswered because the units being asked about had ceased to exist as organized formations. The 2nd Division, a well-oiled machine of coordinated combat power just hours before, fragmented into isolated pockets fighting their own private battles with no understanding of the larger situation. At 6 o'clock, 90 minutes into the bombardment, runners began arriving at battalion and regimental command posts with the first fragmentary reports of what was happening on the ground. A sergeant from a forward company reported German infantry moving through American positions, using the cover of their own artillery to get within grenade range before the defenders could organize resistance. A lieutenant from an observation post described seeing massed infantry formations in the artificial moonlight, more enemy soldiers than he'd seen in 6 months of combat, moving forward in waves that simply absorbed casualties and kept coming. A wounded private, evacuated from a position that no longer existed, mumbled about tigers and panthers, the heavy German tanks that American Sherman struggled to fight even in favorable terrain. The reports painted no coherent picture, just fragments of catastrophe that couldn't be assembled into understanding because the situation was changing faster than information could travel. By 7 o'clock, some units of the 2nd Division still didn't know an offensive had begun. The division sector stretched 18 miles, and the German attack focused on specific penetration points rather than uniform pressure across the entire front. Companies holding positions in quiet sectors heard the bombardment as distant thunder, concerning but not immediately threatening, and continued their morning routines, while miles away their fellow soldiers fought for survival. A mess sergeant prepared breakfast, wondering vaguely about the noise to the east. A supply clerk inventoried ammunition, not yet understanding that every round in his depot would be needed before the day ended. This information gap, this fundamental uncertainty about what was actually happening, characterized the first hours of the German offensive across the entire Ardennes front. The Wehrmacht had achieved strategic surprise so complete that parts of the American army being destroyed still didn't know they were under attack. The identification of German units told the veterans everything they needed to know about what they faced. At 8 o'clock, a signals intelligence team intercepted German radio traffic that included unit designations: 12th SS Panzer Division, the Hitlerjugend, an elite formation of fanatical young soldiers who'd fought with savage effectiveness in Normandy; 2 77th and 12th Volksgrenadier Divisions, infantry formations rebuilt after earlier destruction on the Eastern Front, bringing hard-won experience and the desperate energy of men fighting for a regime that would execute them for failure. These weren't the undertrained garrison units the Americans had been steamrolling since August. These were first-line combat formations, lavishly equipped by German standards, and committed to an operation that had clearly been planned with great care. An intelligence officer circled the unit designations on his map and felt his stomach drop, understanding that the quiet sector had just become the focal point of something enormous. Major General Walter Robertson, commanding the 2nd Infantry Division, received his first comprehensive briefing at division headquarters around 9 o'clock, more than 3 hours after the bombardment began. The headquarters occupied a commandeered Belgian school building several miles behind the front lines, far enough back to avoid direct artillery fire, but close enough that the staff could hear the battle as continuous thunder rolling from the east. Robertson studied the map as his intelligence officer placed markers showing German penetrations, breakthrough attempts, and the fragmentary reports from units still in contact. The picture was incomplete, contradictory in places, terrifying in its implications. The 2nd Division was under attack by forces that outnumbered it at least 2-1, possibly more. The 99th Division to the south was collapsing under similar pressure, and most critically, Robertson's division was supposed to attack toward the Roer dams that very day, meaning significant portions of his combat power were positioned for offense, not defense. If the decision Robertson faced at 9 o'clock would determine whether the 2nd Division survived the next 72 hours. His staff had prepared plans for the attack into Germany, artillery support coordinated, routes of advance mapped, objectives assigned. Executing that attack now, with German forces pouring through American positions, would be suicide, but calling off the attack meant admitting that the division was no longer dictating the tempo of operations, that they'd lost the initiative and were now fighting for survival. It meant repositioning units under fire, a maneuver that military theorists considered among the most dangerous in warfare. It meant trusting his commanders at battalion and company level to execute complex movements while under attack, coordinating through a communications network that barely functioned. Now, Robertson looked at the map, calculated distances and timing and the capabilities of his veteran soldiers, and made the call that would save his division. At 10 o'clock, orders began flowing from division headquarters to the regiments, though flowing overstated the clarity of the communication. Radio messages went out in fragments, often cut off mid-transmission by atmospheric interference or jamming. Motorcycle couriers roared forward carrying written orders, some arriving at command posts that had already been overrun, others finding the officers they sought but unable to return with confirmation because German forces had cut the roads. The essence of the orders was clear enough: cancel the attack, establish defensive positions, and hold. But the details, the crucial specifics of where to defend and how to coordinate the defense, all remained maddeningly vague because Robertson's staff simply didn't know enough about the situation to issue precise orders. Company commanders would have to make their own decisions, trusting that the overall intent would create a coherent defense, even if the individual actions seemed chaotic. The 2nd Battalion of the 9th Infantry Regiment, positioned in Germany near the Wallerscheid Dam as the spearhead of the cancelled attack, received their withdrawal orders around noon. 6.5 hours into the German offensive. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel William McKinley, gathered his company commanders in a forest clearing, still under occasional artillery fire, and explained the situation with the brutal clarity that combat imposes. They were withdrawing, not retreating. There was a difference, he insisted. Though the distinction felt academic when the method involved moving away from the enemy under fire, they would withdraw through forest trails because the roads were already under German observation and fire. They would move at night because daylight movement invited destruction. And they would hold together as a unit because scattered soldiers were dead soldiers, even if staying together made them a more obvious target. The company commanders dispersed to brief their men, and McKinley allowed himself one moment of private terror before forcing his mind back to the professional problem of extracting a battalion from enemy territory while German forces tried to kill them. 10 o'clock in the morning, December 16th, 1944. And Major General Leonard Jarrow stood in his 5th Corps headquarters, studying a map that told him his entire command structure was disintegrating in real time. Red grease pencil marks showed German penetrations growing deeper with each update. Blue markers representing American units became increasingly isolated or simply disappeared when runners failed to return. Jarrow commanded 5 divisions stretched across a front that Allied planning had designated as quiet, a place to rest veteran units and blood-green divisions before the main push into Germany. Now that quiet front was producing fragmentary reports of German armor, massive infantry formations, and artillery concentrations that suggested this was no local counterattack, but a planned offensive of terrifying scope. The question facing Jarrow was simple to state and agonizing to answer. Did he have a front anymore, or just a collection of surrounded units fighting individual battles with no coherent connection? The V Corps mission, as defined in operations plans written just days earlier, was to attack toward the Rower River dams and then exploit toward the Rhine. Those plans now mocked Jarrow from their folders, artifacts of a strategic reality that had ceased to exist at 5:30 that morning. The 2nd Infantry Division, his most experienced and powerful unit, had been postured for that attack with significant forces already across the German border. The 99th Division, green but well-trained, held the southern flank where it was supposed to gain experience through quiet defensive operations. The 106th Division, even greener, and occupied positions further south in what had been the quietest part of the quiet sector. All 3 divisions were now reporting contact with German forces, though the quality and quantity of that contact varied wildly. Jarrow needed to understand whether he faced a unified German offensive or multiple separate attacks, because the answer would determine his response. At 10:30, Jarrow's intelligence officer delivered an assessment based on accumulated reports, prisoner interrogations, and signals intelligence. The Germans had committed at least 6 divisions to the offensive in V Corps sector alone, with indications of more forces in adjacent areas. Identified units included elite SS Panzer formations, rebuilt Volksgrenadier divisions, and armored brigades equipped with the newest Panthers and Tigers. The officer estimated German strength at 50,000 troops minimum, possibly 75,000, attacking along axes that clearly aimed for the road network leading west toward the Meuse River. This wasn't a spoiling attack to disrupt American offensive preparations. This was an attempt to achieve operational breakthrough, to split the Allied armies and reach the coast. The intelligence officer delivered this assessment in the flat professional tone of a man reporting catastrophe, and watched his commander's face for the reaction that would tell him whether V Corps would stand or collapse. Jarrow made his decision by 11 o'clock, consulting briefly with his staff, but ultimately trusting his own judgment forged through 3 years of war. V Corps would not attempt to hold everywhere, which was impossible anyway given the force ratios and the violence of the German attack. Instead, they would identify critical terrain, defend it with concentrated force, and accept that some positions would have to be abandoned to create that concentration. The critical terrain was obvious to anyone who studied the map. Elsenborn Ridge, an unremarkable piece of high ground that controlled the northern road network. If the Germans took Elsenborn, they could pour west toward Malmedy and Spa, unhinging the entire northern shoulder of whatever defensive line the Americans managed to establish. If the Americans held Elsenborn, they could funnel German forces into killing grounds and prevent the breakthrough from achieving operational significance. Every other decision would flow from this central calculation. If the order to the 2nd Infantry Division went out at 11:30. Break contact with the enemy in the Wallerscheid area, withdraw to positions covering the twin villages of Krinkelt and Rocherath, and prepare to defend Elsenborn Ridge. The order was simple to issue and hellishly complex to execute because it required Robertson's division to transition from offense to defense while already engaged with the enemy, withdrawing across difficult terrain under fire while maintaining unit cohesion. Military theorists consider such operations among the most challenging in warfare, requiring discipline, communications, and leadership at every level. Gero was asking Robertson to execute this maneuver with a communications network that barely functioned in winter weather, against an enemy that had achieved surprise and now possessed momentum. The order assumed capabilities that existed more in doctrine than reality, and both generals knew it. Robertson received the order at noon and immediately understood its implications. His division would have to fight 2 battles simultaneously. A rearguard action in Germany to extract the units that had advanced for the cancelled offensive, and a hasty defense at Krinkelt Rocherath to prevent German forces from reaching Elsenborn Ridge before the withdrawal completed. He had perhaps 24 hours to accomplish both tasks before the German offensive's momentum overwhelmed his forces. The 2nd Battalion, 9th Infantry, already had their withdrawal orders and were preparing to move. But other units, scattered across the division's 18-mile sector, would need to disengage, displace, and reposition while German forces pressed them at every point. Robertson called his regimental commanders on the still-functioning radio net and delivered orders with the confidence his rank required, even as he privately calculated the casualties this maneuver would cost. At 1 o'clock, maps were being redrawn in command posts across the V-Corps sector, as officers translated Gero's intent into executable orders. Blue markers showing American positions began migrating west, repositioning toward Elsenborn Ridge. Red markers showing German forces continued pushing west, the 2 movements creating a race whose outcome would determine whether the Americans could establish a coherent defense or would be overrun piecemeal. Staff officers calculated march rates and distance, trying to determine if American units could reach defensive positions before German armor. The math was not encouraging. German mechanized units moved faster than American infantry on foot, and the Germans had the advantage of initiative, choosing when and where to press their attacks. The only advantage the Americans possessed was knowledge of the terrain and the presence of the 2nd Division, veteran soldiers who understood that panic killed faster than German bullets. The 99th Division, fighting its first major battle just days after entering the line, was collapsing under pressure that would have tested veteran formations. Reports from 99th positions described entire companies being overrun, battalion command posts abandoning their positions. And a general disintegration of the defensive line that intelligence officers had thought was solid. Gero faced a terrible choice: reinforce the 99th and risk weakening the Elsenborn defense, or accept that Green troops would suffer catastrophic casualties while buying time for veterans to establish positions. He chose the latter, a decision that would haunt him, but which military logic dictated was correct. The 99th Division would hold as long as possible, and when they broke, their retreat would hopefully be slow enough to allow the 2nd Division to prepare the real defense. At 2 o'clock, the first American units began their movement toward Krinkelt Rocherath and Elsenborn Ridge. Companies that had spent the morning repelling German attacks now broke contact and displaced west, all leaving their dead where they'd fallen and carrying their wounded on improvised litters because ambulances couldn't reach forward positions. Artillery batteries fired their ammunition stockpiles into German assembly areas, then limbered their guns and pulled back to positions where they could support the new defensive line. Combat engineers prepared demolitions on bridges and road junctions, calculating the precise timing that would deny routes to German forces while leaving them open for American withdrawal. The movement was ragged, units arriving at assembly areas at different times and in different states of cohesion, but it was movement, which meant the 2nd Division still functioned as an organization rather than a collection of terrified individuals. The calculation Gero and Robertson had made was brutal in its simplicity. Trade space for time, accept casualties now to prevent catastrophe later, and trust that veteran soldiers would execute complex maneuvers under conditions that would break lesser units. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, on December 16th, that calculation was being tested along an 18-mile front as the 2nd Infantry Division attempted the most dangerous operation in military science. The success or failure of this maneuver would determine whether the northern shoulder of the German offensive collapsed or held, whether the Wehrmacht could access the road network leading to the Meuse River, and ultimately whether Hitler's desperate gamble had any chance of success. Everything now depended on whether veteran American soldiers, exhausted and terrified, could maintain their discipline while retreating toward a ridge that most of them couldn't yet see. 4:30 in the afternoon, December 16th, 1944. Lieutenant Colonel William McKinley stood at the edge of a German forest watching his battalion assemble for a withdrawal that violated every instinct combat had taught them. Soldiers of the 2nd Battalion, 9th Infantry, had spent 6 months learning that survival meant advancing, that standing still invited death, that victory came from pressing forward even when every nerve screamed to take cover. Now, McKinley was ordering them to turn around and walk away from the enemy, to abandon positions they'd taken at considerable cost, to move through darkness on forest trails while German forces pursued them. The men understood the necessity intellectually, but resisted it emotionally, and McKinley could see that resistance in their faces as they gathered in the failing light. He gave them the only thing a commander could give in such moments: the truth delivered without sugarcoating, and the promise that he'd bring them out alive if discipline held. The battalion formed a column of companies, each unit assigned a position in the march and a specific responsibility for the whole. Lead companies would navigate the forest trails using compasses and maps, because the trails themselves were barely visible even in daylight. Middle companies carried the wounded, men dosed with morphine and strapped to improvised litters fashioned from tree branches and shelter halves. Rear companies would serve as rear guard, positioned to delay any German pursuit and buy time for the main column to escape. McKinley positioned himself in the middle of the column, where he could communicate with all elements and respond to crises as they developed. At 5 o'clock, with perhaps an hour of twilight remaining, the battalion began moving west through forests so dense that men could barely see the soldier in front of them. The first crisis came within 30 minutes, when the lead company reported the trail blocked by fallen trees, whether from recent storms or German preparation nobody could determine. The column stopped while scouts searched for alternative routes, 800 men standing vulnerable in the darkness while their officers studied maps by shielded flashlight. A German artillery barrage would have destroyed the battalion in those frozen minutes. But the barrage didn't come, suggesting German forces were either unaware of the American withdrawal or too disorganized to respond. The scouts found a bypass that added a mile to the march and required soldiers to negotiate a ravine in complete darkness. But it was a rout, and movement resumed. The incident cost 45 minutes that McKinley's timetable couldn't afford, but stopping would cost more, so the battalion pressed on through forest that seemed designed to trap them. At 8 o'clock, 3 hours into the withdrawal, the column's rear guard made contact with German forces probing east from Krinkelt. A brief, vicious firefight erupted in the darkness, muzzle flashes providing the only illumination as American riflemen engaged an enemy they couldn't see clearly enough to count. The rearguard commander, a captain who'd learned his trade at Omaha Beach, deployed his men across the trail and held for 20 minutes before breaking contact and sprinting to catch the main column. 2 men didn't make it out, their bodies left in the forest because stopping to retrieve them would risk the entire battalion. The captain reported the contact to McKinley with the emotional flatness that characterized veteran soldiers describing their own near-death experiences, and the column increased its pace because German forces were now definitely aware of and pursuing the withdrawal. Midnight found the battalion strung out over 2 miles of forest trail, cohesion degrading as tired men struggled to maintain contact with units ahead and behind them. Some soldiers had been awake for 20 hours, fighting for half that time before beginning a forced march through hostile territory. The wounded moaned despite morphine, and the men carrying their litters rotated every 100 yards because the weight became unbearable faster than that. A private later described walking in a trance, following the man ahead of him without conscious thought, aware only of cold and exhaustion, and the animal need to keep moving because stopping meant death. The battalion was approaching the point where soldiers would simply collapse from exhaustion, and McKinley knew that once men started falling, the column would disintegrate into individuals focused only on personal survival rather than collective escape. At 2 o'clock in the morning on December 17th, the lead elements of the 2nd Battalion, 9th Infantry, stumbled into Withdrawal, a village that was supposed to be behind American lines but was instead receiving sporadic German artillery fire. The battalion had covered 12 miles through forested terrain in darkness, maintained unit cohesion despite contact with the enemy, and successfully extracted itself from what could have been a surrounding movement. But the cost had been substantial. 40% of the rearguard companies were casualties, either killed, wounded, or missing in the forest. Equipment had been abandoned, everything that couldn't be carried by exhausted men, including trucks, heavy mortars, and battalion records. And the men themselves were operating on reserves of will that couldn't be replenished by a few hours of sleep in a building under artillery fire. Dawn on December the 17th revealed the reality of what the withdrawal had accomplished and what it had cost. The battalion occupied buildings in Withdrawal that provided shelter from wind but no protection from artillery. Soldiers collapsing into sleep despite the intermittent shelling because exhaustion demanded payment. McKinley established a command post in a cellar and received reports from his company commanders about casualties, ammunition status, and the mental state of troops who'd been awake for 28 hours. The numbers were not encouraging. The battalion was at 70% strength, down to perhaps 600 effective soldiers, and those soldiers were exhausted to the point where their combat effectiveness was questionable. But they were alive, organized, and behind what was beginning to resemble a defensive line. At 8 o'clock on the morning of December the 17th, orders arrived for the battalion to continue west to Krinkelt Rocherath and establish defensive positions in the twin villages. The men received this order with the resignation of soldiers who understood that their suffering had purchased nothing except the opportunity to suffer more. They formed up in daylight, a ragged column that bore little resemblance to the disciplined formation that had trained stateside and landed at Normandy. These were the survivors of the road back, men who'd executed the most dangerous maneuver in warfare and lived to face whatever came next. They moved toward Krinkelt Rocherath, knowing that the German forces pursuing them would arrive soon, that the defensive battle would begin before they could rest. And that the stone buildings ahead would become either their fortress or their tomb. The withdrawal of 2nd Battalion, 9th Infantry, represented one small piece of a larger movement as the entire 2nd Infantry Division repositioned from offense to defense. Other battalions made similar marches, faced similar crises, and paid similar costs in men and equipment. But unlike some units that disintegrated during their withdrawals, becoming refugees rather than soldiers, McKinley's battalion maintained enough cohesion to function as a combat unit. This difference between organized withdrawal and panicked retreat would prove critical in the hours ahead, because the defense of Krinkelt Rocherath required not just bodies but organized units capable of coordinated action. The road back had been hell, but it had also been necessary. Bull and the men who survived it had proven they possessed the discipline required for what came next. The battalion trudged toward Krinkelt Rocherath, under a sky heavy with clouds that promised more snow. Behind them, German forces occupied the positions they had abandoned, consolidating their gains and preparing to push west toward the ridge that dominated the horizon. Ahead, combat engineers worked frantically to prepare defensive positions in villages that had been quiet rear area billeting sites just 24 hours earlier. The race between American preparation and German pursuit was entering its critical phase, and the exhausted men of 2nd Battalion represented the difference between having defenders in position when the enemy arrived or having empty buildings that would fall without a fight. They walked toward their defensive positions with the grim knowledge that the battle was just beginning. 10 o'clock in the morning, December the 17th, 1944. A combat engineer from the 2nd Engineer Battalion swung a sledgehammer through the stone wall of a Belgian house in Krinkelt, creating a firing port that would allow a bazooka team to engage German tanks while protected by 3 feet of masonry. The house shook with each impact, centuries-old stonework cracking to accommodate weapons that hadn't existed when these buildings were constructed. In the street outside, Other engineers positioned anti-tank mines at intersections, calculated fields of fire, and marked buildings with chalk codes indicating which positions would support which others. The twin villages of Krinkelt and Rocherath, it's separated by less than a quarter mile of farmland, were being transformed from peaceful Belgian communities into fortresses whose stone buildings would channel German armor into carefully prepared kill zones. The transformation required a cold calculation about which buildings could be sacrificed to German fire and which had to be held at any cost. The villages occupied critical terrain through no particular merit of their own, simply the accident of geography that placed them 2 miles from the German border and directly between German forces and Elsenborn Ridge. Narrow streets designed for horse-drawn carts rather than mechanized warfare would force German tanks into single file where American anti-tank weapons could engage them at close range. Stone buildings built to withstand Ardennes winters all provided natural strongpoints that could absorb significant punishment while protecting defenders. And the open approaches from the east, cleared farmland with minimal cover, gave American observers clear fields of fire to direct artillery. The villages were tactically valuable, not because they were strong, but because the terrain around them was weak, turning what should have been easily bypassed obstacles into positions that demanded German assault. At noon, officers from 5 different battalions gathered in a Krinkelt basement to coordinate a defense that, doctrine said, should have been organized at regimental level with days of preparation. Instead, they had hours and a command structure improvised from whoever had survived the morning's fighting and withdrawal. A major from the 38th Infantry assumed overall command not because of rank, but because his battalion still maintained radio contact with division headquarters. Company commanders sketched defensive sectors on a hand-drawn map, dividing the villages into zones of responsibility that overlapped to prevent German infiltration. Artillery forward observers claimed positions in church steeples and second-story windows, beginning the process of pre-registering targets on every approach route. The meeting lasted 20 minutes because that was all the time available, and officers dispersed to their units with plans that existed more as shared understanding than written orders. German forces, that specifically the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, approached Krinkelt Rocherath with confidence born from 2 days of successful attacks and the belief that American forces were retreating in disorder. SS Standartenführer Wilhelm Mohnke, commanding the division, studied his maps at a forward command post, and calculated that his Panthers could reach Malmedy by nightfall if the resistance at these villages proved as weak as earlier encounters. His intelligence reported American forces in the villages, but estimates suggested battalion strength at most, remnants of units already mauled in earlier fighting. The villages themselves appeared insignificant on maps, just another Belgian farming community to be bypassed or crushed, depending on resistance levels. Mohnke ordered his armor forward with infantry support, anticipating a brief fight, followed by exploitation toward the real objective, Elsenborn Ridge and the roads beyond. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, American observers in Krinkelt reported movement on the eastern approaches, Panthers and infantry advancing in a textbook, combined arms formation that would have destroyed a disorganized defense. The observers called coordinates to artillery batteries positioned on Elsenborn Ridge, and within minutes, the first shells began landing among the advancing Germans. Explosions erupted in the winter fields, forcing German infantry to ground and disrupting the careful coordination between armor and infantry. But the Panthers kept coming, because their crews knew that artillery alone couldn't stop determined armor, and the Americans would eventually have to engage them directly. The lead Panther reached the edge of Krinkelt at 3 o'clock, its commander confident that American forces would break once German armor entered the streets. The first Panther died at 3:30, killed by a bazooka team firing from a second-story window in a building the tank commander had dismissed as abandoned. The rocket punched through the Panther's thinner side armor and detonated inside, killing the crew instantly and leaving the tank burning in the middle of Krinkelt's main street. The burning Panther blocked the street, forcing following tanks to seek alternative routes that had also been carefully prepared as kill zones. A second Panther fell to a tank destroyer positioned in a barn, its crew waiting until the German tank passed before shooting it in the rear where armor was thinnest. German infantry, all separated from their armor by American fire and the narrow streets, found themselves fighting house to house against defenders who knew every corner and doorway. At 5 o'clock, as winter darkness fell, the battle for Krinkelt Rocherath settled into a close-quarters nightmare that neither side had anticipated. German forces controlled parts of eastern Krinkelt, but couldn't advance further without sustaining unacceptable casualties. American forces held most of Rocherath and western Krinkelt, but lacked the strength to counterattack and clear German-held areas. The two forces occupied buildings within grenade range of each other, sometimes the same building with Germans on the first floor and Americans on the second. Small unit actions erupted without warning as patrols collided in darkness, at muzzle flashes illuminating stone walls for brief moments before darkness returned. Artillery from both sides pounded the villages indiscriminately, killing friend and foe with equal efficiency because observers couldn't distinguish targets in the darkness and confusion. The 12th SS Panzer Division's advance, which should have punched through weak American resistance and reached Elsenborn Ridge by nightfall, had instead become bogged down in a street fight that consumed resources and time without producing the breakthrough Monkey needed. 6 Panthers burned in Krinkelt streets, their crews dead inside vehicles that had been nearly invulnerable in open terrain, but fatally vulnerable in urban combat. German infantry casualties mounted, as American defenders fought with the competence of veterans who understood that retreating from these villages meant abandoning the entire defensive position. By midnight on December the 17th, the supposedly insignificant twin villages had absorbed an entire day of German offensive effort and remained in American hands, though barely. American defenders knew that holding Krinkelt Rocherath for one day meant nothing if they couldn't hold for 2, 3, or however many days the broader battle required. Ammunition stocks were depleting faster than resupply could replenish them because the routes into the villages were under German fire. Casualties were accumulating in aid stations that lacked proper medical facilities or evacuation routes for the wounded. And the men themselves, fighting continuously since the German offensive began, were approaching the limits of human endurance. A lieutenant commanding a company in eastern Krinkelt reported to his battalion commander at midnight that his men would hold their positions because ordered to do so, but he offered no assessment of how long they could sustain the defense. The battalion commander accepted this report without asking for clarification, because both men understood that some questions had no answers until events provided them. The battle for the twin villages on December the 17th established the pattern that would define the next 3 days. German forces committed to taking villages that American forces were equally committed to holding, both sides paying in blood for ground that mattered only because the other side wanted it. Stone buildings that had sheltered Belgian families for generations became fortresses and tombs, their walls scarred by bullets and scorched by fire. The streets where children had played now contained burning tanks and bodies that neither side could retrieve because the fighting never stopped long enough to collect the dead. Krinkelt Rocherath, unknown to anyone outside the Ardennes before December 16th, was becoming a name that survivors would carry for the rest of their lives, synonymous with close-quarters savagery and the particular terror of combat where the enemy was close enough to hear breathing. 10 o'clock in the evening, December 17th, 1944. A medic from the 23rd Infantry crouched in a Krinkelt basement that had been converted into an aid station, performing triage by candlelight because electrical power had failed hours earlier. Wounded soldiers covered every horizontal surface, men on tables, men on floors, men propped against stone walls because there was nowhere else to put them. The medic moved from casualty to casualty, making decisions that no medical training had prepared him for, sorting men into categories that translated to who lived, who died, and who suffered in between. A soldier with a sucking chest wound received immediate attention because the medic could save him. A soldier with abdominal wounds and signs of internal bleeding received morphine because the medic couldn't save him. A soldier with a mangled leg received a tourniquet and a promise of evacuation that both men knew might never come. The basement smelled of blood, antiseptic, and the particular stench of human bodies under extreme stress, and the medic worked through it with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd shut down every emotion except the professional focus required to keep working. December 18th brought no respite, only escalation. At 6 o'clock in the morning, a Panther tank drove through the wall of a building, serving as battalion headquarters for the 9th Infantry. The 75-ton vehicle simply crushing stonework that had stood for 2 centuries. The battalion commander found himself directing defense from a pile of rubble, shouting orders to officers who couldn't hear him over the sound of the tank's engine and the gunfire erupting throughout the building. American soldiers engaged the Panther at ranges measured in feet, tossing grenades at vision ports and firing bazookas at tracks, because those were the only vulnerable points they could reach. The Panther withdrew after 5 minutes that felt like hours, backing out of the hole it had created and leaving the building structurally compromised, but still occupied by defenders who'd proven that German armor couldn't simply drive through the American defense. The fight for Rocherath's church became a battle within the battle, a microcosm of the larger struggle condensed into a single stone building. German forces had occupied the church during the night, using its steeple as an observation post to direct fire throughout the American sector. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, on December 18th, a company from the 38th Infantry counterattacked to retake the building, a fighting room-to-room upstairs slick with blood, and through a sanctuary where pews had been overturned to create barricades. The fighting was intimate and savage, grenades thrown through doorways followed by riflemen who shot at anything that moved. The Americans retook the church after an hour of combat that left 23 men dead inside a building dedicated to peace, and immediately began fortifying it against the German counterattack they knew would come before dark. Ammunition became the critical constraint by midday on December 18th, with some units reporting they were down to a single magazine per rifle and counting grenades like currency. A resupply convoy attempted to reach the villages at 2:30. 6 trucks loaded with ammunition, medical supplies, and rations that soldiers hadn't eaten in 2 days. German artillery caught the convoy on the approach road, destroying 3 trucks and forcing the others to turn back. A second attempt at 4 o'clock succeeded in reaching Rocherath, but at terrible cost. 2 trucks destroyed, 4 drivers killed, and only half the anticipated supplies delivered. The battalion commanders receiving these supplies faced impossible mathematics. They needed 3 times what they'd received to sustain operations for another day. But the supply line couldn't deliver that volume without losses that would soon exhaust the available trucks and drivers. December 19th began with both sides, exhausted to the point where combat became a matter of who could force their bodies to keep functioning through sheer will. American soldiers who'd been awake for 3 days operated in a fugue state, executing complex tactical movements through muscle memory because their conscious minds had shut down everything except immediate survival. German soldiers, equally exhausted and now aware that the easy breakthrough they had been promised, had turned into an urban meat grinder, pressed attacks with diminishing enthusiasm. A German prisoner, captured during a failed assault on Krinkelt's western edge, told his interrogators that his company had lost 60% of its strength in 2 days and that officers were threatening to shoot men who refused to attack. The interrogator filed this report without comment, because it described a situation identical to what American units were experiencing. At dawn on December 19th, temperatures dropped below freezing and stayed there, adding environmental suffering to combat casualties. Wounded men in the aid stations shivered despite blankets because the buildings had no heat beyond what candles and body warmth provided. Soldiers in fighting positions stamped their feet continuously to prevent frostbite, a rhythmic sound that became the backdrop to combat. Water froze in canteens, weapons malfunctioned from cold, and men who'd thought they understood cold revised their definitions as Belgian winter demonstrated its capacity for cruelty. A lieutenant later described the cold as worse than German fire, because fire came in bursts, but cold never stopped, never gave any respite, just kept draining heat and energy and life from men who had none of those things to spare. The order to withdraw to Elsenborn Ridge arrived at 6 o'clock in the evening on December 19th, and soldiers received it with emotions too complex to categorize. Relief that the defensive battle was ending, mixed with anger at abandoning positions they'd defended at such cost. The wounded posed the most immediate problem. Men who couldn't walk would have to be carried to vehicles for evacuation, but vehicles would have to run a gauntlet of German fire to reach the villages and extract them. Medics and litter bearers began the grim work of moving casualties to collection points while combat soldiers maintained defensive positions. A division of labor that felt obscene because everyone understood some wounded men wouldn't survive the evacuation, even if the vehicles reached them. The evacuation of wounded began at midnight on December 19th. The ambulances and trucks racing into Krinkelt Rocherath, with headlights off to avoid German fire. Drivers navigated by memory and sheer nerve, following roads they'd memorized during daylight runs and hoping German forces hadn't positioned anti-tank weapons along routes they couldn't see. Loading wounded men into vehicles designed for cargo rather than casualties meant inflicting pain on soldiers who'd already suffered beyond measure, but medics worked with the efficiency of men who understood that gentleness was a luxury they couldn't afford. Some wounded begged to be left behind rather than endure the evacuation. Others made no sound at all, shock or morphine or simple exhaustion, rendering them silent passengers in their own trauma. The evacuation continued through the night, each successful trip and small victory against chaos and death. December 20th brought the final phase of withdrawal, as combat units disengaged from German forces and pulled back toward Elsenborn Ridge. Combat engineers prepared demolitions on buildings and road junctions, calculating the timing that would deny the villages to German forces without killing American soldiers still moving through the streets. The last American soldiers left Krinkelt at 4 o'clock in the morning on December 20th. Rearguard elements firing parting shots before sprinting west toward positions their comrades had already occupied. Engineers detonated their charges at 4:30. Explosions erupting throughout the twin villages and bringing down buildings that had survived 3 days of combat. The demolition served no practical military purpose because German forces would occupy the ruins regardless. But they offered soldiers the psychological satisfaction of denying the enemy something, even if that something was only rubble. Dawn on December 20th revealed Krinkelt Rocherath from German perspectives, and what the Germans found was devastation that exceeded even Eastern Front standards. 6 Panther tanks burned in the streets, their hulks blocking movement and spreading toxic smoke across the villages. Buildings had been reduced to fragments, walls standing alone where structures had collapsed around them. Bodies lay where they'd fallen because neither side had been able to retrieve them during the fighting, American and German dead, mixing together in the democracy of death. The Germans had won a tactical victory by occupying the villages, but they'd paid a price that made the victory hollow, an estimated 2,000 casualties for terrain that had value only as a stepping stone to Elsenborn Ridge. And when German officers looked west from Krinkelt's ruins, they saw that ridge clearly for the first time, bristling with American positions, and understood that the real battle was just beginning. December the 17th, 1944, while infantry fought and died in Krinkelt Rocherath. A bulldozer operator from the 2nd Engineer Battalion attacked frozen Belgian earth 2 miles west on Elsenborn Ridge, his blade scraping slowly through ground hardened by winter cold. The engineers had been working since December 16th, racing to prepare defensive positions before the infantry arrived needing them, or gambling that the fighting in the twin villages would buy enough time. Each fighting position required hours of labor, digging through frozen topsoil to reach earth soft enough to excavate, piling the excavated dirt into parapets that would provide protection from small arms fire, calculating fields of fire to ensure positions supported each other. The bulldozer helped, but frozen ground resisted even mechanized assault, and the engineers supplemented dozers with picks and shovels and the muscle power of men who understood that incomplete positions meant dead soldiers. Artillery officers arrived on Elsenborn Ridge on December the 17th, with a mandate to create the most concentrated artillery defense in the European theater. They positioned 12 battalions and 192 guns ranging from 75mm pack howitzers to 155mm heavy pieces, across terrain that offered clear fields of fire toward Krinkelt Rocherath and the approaches beyond. Fire direction centers established communications with forward observers, pre-registered targets on every conceivable German approach route, and calculated ammunition requirements that staggered the supply officers responsible for delivering thousands of shells daily. An artillery major, surveying the gun positions on December 18th, remarked to his staff that they were creating either the most effective defensive artillery system he'd ever seen, or a concentration that would attract every German gun within range. His staff nodded without comment, because both assessments were probably correct. The ridge itself was geologically unremarkable, gaining only 200 feet of elevation above the surrounding countryside through a gradual slope rather than dramatic cliffs. But that modest elevation provided military advantages that transformed mediocre terrain into critical ground. Observers on the ridge could see for miles in every direction when weather permitted, spotting German movements long before those forces could engage American positions. Artillery positioned on the ridge fired from positions German counter-battery fire struggled to locate and suppress, and the approaches to the ridge, open farmland with minimal cover, created killing grounds where American firepower could destroy German forces with brutal efficiency. Geography had created a defensive position, and American engineers and artillerymen were perfecting what nature had provided. December 18th saw defensive preparations accelerate, as reports from Krinkelt Rocherath made clear the villages wouldn't hold indefinitely. Engineers laid anti-tank mines along probable German approach routes, positioned anti-tank guns in positions offering long-range fields of fire, and strung barbed wire to channel German infantry into pre-registered artillery targets. Infantry companies arriving from the twin villages received defensive sectors and immediately began improving the positions engineers had prepared, adding overhead cover against artillery and camouflaging positions against aerial observation. A sergeant from the 9th Infantry, arriving with his squad after 3 days of continuous combat, all looked at the prepared positions and felt something he hadn't experienced since December 16th, the possibility that they might actually survive the next German attack. Forward observers represented the critical link between observation and destruction, the men who would translate what they saw into artillery fire that could shatter German attacks before those attacks reached American positions. They established observation posts in positions offering maximum visibility, church steeples in villages behind the ridge, second-story windows in farmhouses, even hastily constructed platforms in trees. Each observer carried maps marked with pre-registered target coordinates, radio equipment for communicating with fire direction centers, and binoculars powerful enough to identify German unit types at extreme ranges. And a forward observer from the 37th Field Artillery Battalion later described the view from his observation post on December 18th. Krinkelt Rocherath, burning 2 miles east, German forces moving through the smoke, and the terrible professional satisfaction of calling coordinates, knowing that shells would arrive within minutes. The withdrawal from Krinkelt Rocherath on December 20th unfolded as a carefully choreographed operation rather than panicked retreat. Companies leapfrogging back through prepared positions while artillery covered their movement. Lead elements established positions on the ridge while rear guards maintained contact with German forces, creating a continuous defensive line rather than gaps that Germans could exploit. The movement required precise timing and communication that the degraded American radio net barely supported, but veteran soldiers compensated for technical limitations through experience and the shared understanding that comes from fighting together. A company commander described the withdrawal as the most professionally executed operation he'd witnessed in 6 months of combat, all the more remarkable because it occurred under fire after 3 days of continuous fighting. At midnight on December 20th, the last American soldiers crossed onto Elsenborn Ridge and occupied positions that 3 days of engineering had prepared. Combat engineers detonated demolitions in Krinkelt Rocherath, and the explosions marked a transition from mobile defense to static positions, burst from fighting for villages to fighting for a ridge that would define the battle's outcome. Soldiers settling into fighting positions experienced the strange relief of knowing exactly where they'd be tomorrow, that the chaos of withdrawal had ended and been replaced by the different anxiety of waiting for the enemy to come to them. An officer walking the defensive line at 2 o'clock in the morning on December 21st counted positions and checked fields of fire and felt cautiously optimistic for the first time since the German offensive began. Dawn on December 21st revealed Elsenborn Ridge from German perspectives approaching from Krinkelt Rocherath. What the Germans saw was a ridge that looked deceptively unimpressive from a distance, its gentle slopes suggesting terrain that mechanized forces could easily assault. But experienced German officers, studying the ridge through binoculars, noted details that concerned them: the systematic arrangement of fighting positions suggesting extensive preparation, the absence of visible activity suggesting strong fire discipline, and the knowledge from signals intelligence that American artillery had concentrated on and around the ridge in quantities that exceeded anything Germans had faced in the West. A German battalion commander, viewing the ridge on the morning of December 21st, expressed to his staff the opinion that they were being ordered to assault a prepared defensive position with insufficient forces. But orders were orders, and the assault would proceed regardless of his professional assessment. The transformation of Elsenborn Ridge from empty ground to fortress had required 3 days of continuous labor, while infantry fought and died to buy that time. Engineers had excavated more than 300 fighting positions, each carefully sited to support others and create interlocking fields of fire. Artillery had positioned 12 battalions in a concentration that allowed them to mass fires on any point threatening the defensive line. Supply lines running west to Liège remained open and functional, ensuring ammunition and replacements would flow forward while casualties flowed back. The defensive position wasn't perfect, because warfare allows no perfection, but it was professional, comprehensive, and created by veterans who understood that preparation measured in hours often determined battles measured in days. The calculated retreat from Krinkelt Rocherath to Elsenborn Ridge represented one of the most successful defensive operations in American military history, though it received no recognition at the time and little since. The 2nd Infantry Division had traded space for time, accepted casualties in the twin villages to create a defense that would prove unbreakable on the ridge, and executed complex maneuvers under fire while maintaining organizational cohesion. Military theorists would later analyze the operation in detail, teaching it in staff colleges as an example of how veteran units could compensate for surprise and numerical disadvantage through superior training and leadership. But on December 21st, 1944, the men who'd executed this retreat knew only that they'd survive to face another day, and that the defensive positions they now occupied were either salvation or tomb, depending on whether German forces possessed the strength to take them. 8 o'clock in the morning, December 20th, 1944. SS Oberstgruppenführer Sepp Dietrich stood in his 6th Panzer Army headquarters, studying maps that told him his offensive had failed in its most critical sector. Red lines showing German advances through the Ardennes bulged west and south, creating the bulge that would give the battle its name, but in Dietrich's northern sector, those red lines had barely moved. The 12th SS Panzer Division, his elite formation of fanatical soldiers and the newest Panthers, had spent 4 days capturing 2 villages and suffering casualties that would cripple any normal unit. Now those villages were ruins. All and beyond them lay Elsenborn Ridge bristling with American positions that reconnaissance reported in concerning detail. Dietrich had commanded armored forces since the Eastern Front, had seen terrible fighting at Kursk and in the retreat through Russia, but he'd always been attacking, exploiting, moving. The American defense at Elsenborn confronted him with a problem he'd never successfully solved: how to break prepared positions defended by competent soldiers. The operational timeline was already catastrophic by any objective measure. Operation Watch on the Rhine, Hitler's plan to split the Allied armies and capture Antwerp, required German forces to reach the Meuse River within 7 days of the initial attack. Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army was supposed to provide the northern thrust, in racing through weak American positions and capturing the bridges at Liège before Allied forces could react. 4 days into the offensive, the 6th Panzer Army remained east of Elsenborn Ridge, having advanced perhaps 8 miles from its start line against a planned advance of 60 miles. Simple arithmetic showed the operation was failing, but arithmetic didn't account for Hitler's refusal to acknowledge failure or modify plans based on battlefield realities. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon on December 20th, Dietrich convened his division commanders for an assessment that everyone in the room knew would be brutally honest in private and optimistically false in any report to higher headquarters. The commanders reported their situations with the professional candor possible only among men who'd fought together for years. The 12th SS Panzer Division was at 60% strength after 4 days of combat, having lost 80 tanks and 3,000 men for negligible territorial gains. The 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division had been committed to support the SS attack and immediately became entangled in the urban fighting at Krinkelt Rocherath, suffering casualties without accomplishing any meaningful advance. Infantry divisions supporting the armor reported ammunition shortages, fuel shortages, and the steady attrition of men and equipment that occurs when attacks produce no results except casualty lists. The division commanders presented Dietrich with alternatives, routes that might bypass Elsenborn Ridge and access the road network through less heavily defended terrain. A panzer general traced his finger along the map, showing routes south through the Losheim Gap, where the 99th Division had been shattered, suggesting that 6th Panzer Army forces could reinforce the breakthrough achieved by 5th Panzer Army in that sector. Another commander proposed shifting the entire axis of advance south, accepting the reality that Elsenborn Ridge had become impassable and seeking success elsewhere. The alternatives were militarily sound, professional assessments from experienced commanders who understood that continuing to attack strength while ignoring weakness violated fundamental tactical principles. Dietrich listened, asked questions, and then explained why none of the alternatives were possible. Hitler had personally approved the 6th Panzer Army's route of advance, is designating the roads through Malmedy and Spa as the primary axis for the northern thrust. Those roads remained inaccessible as long as American forces held Elsenborn Ridge, but Hitler's operational plan allowed no flexibility to modify routes based on enemy resistance. The Losheim Gap routes, already clogged with 5th Panzer Army traffic, couldn't accommodate additional divisions without creating traffic jams that would paralyze the entire offensive. And shifting forces south would mean admitting that the northern thrust had failed, an admission that would bring consequences none of them wanted to contemplate. Dietrich delivered this explanation without visible emotion because showing doubt would undermine his commander's will. All but the men in the room understood. They were being ordered to continue an operation that had already failed for political reasons that had nothing to do with military logic. At 6 o'clock in the evening on December 20th, word arrived from Hitler's headquarters demanding progress reports and threatening consequences for commanders who failed to maintain offensive momentum. The message was transmitted through military channels, but carried political weight that exceeded its military content. A reminder that SS commanders served 2 hierarchies, and that failure in military operations could result in political liquidation. Dietrich composed his response with care, reporting the capture of Krinkelt Rocherath as a success, while minimizing the casualties required, and omitting any mention of the defensive positions the Americans now occupied on Elsenborn Ridge. The report was factually accurate in its details and completely misleading in its implications, but it satisfied the immediate requirement to demonstrate progress while buying time to determine whether the next attack would succeed or fail. December 21st brought the decision that would define the 6th Panzer Army's role in the Ardennes offensive. Dietrich ordered the 12th SS and 3rd Panzer Grenadier Divisions to assault Elsenborn Ridge, committing forces he knew were inadequate to the task, against positions he knew were well prepared. The order violated his professional judgment, ignored his commander's assessments, and sentenced thousands of men to death or maiming for objectives that couldn't be achieved with available forces. But the order came down because refusing would mean challenging Hitler's plan, accepting strategic failure while the offensive continued elsewhere, and facing consequences that made military death preferable. Dietrich issued the attack orders with the fatalistic resignation of a man who'd seen too much combat to harbor illusions about what would happen next. The attack orders distributed to division and regiment commanders on the afternoon of December 21st described objectives, routes of advance, and artillery support with the precise language of military planning. But the officers receiving those orders could read between the lines. An understanding that they were being asked to accomplish what recent experience suggested was impossible. A battalion commander from the 12th SS, briefing his company commanders in a Belgian farmhouse, described the attack plan and watched their faces register the reality that this would be a frontal assault against prepared positions supported by overwhelming artillery. Nobody challenged the orders because challenging orders was not a concept that existed in the SS. but the commander dismissed his officers with the simple instruction to ensure their men's wills were updated and their personal effects organized, because many wouldn't survive the next 48 hours. German intelligence had failed catastrophically to assess American strength on Elsenborn Ridge, estimating perhaps 2 battalions in defensive positions when the actual force approached full division strength. The intelligence failure stemmed partly from American camouflage and deception efforts, partly from overcast weather preventing aerial reconnaissance, and partly from the tendency of intelligence officers to tell commanders what they wanted to hear rather than uncomfortable truths. Reconnaissance patrols sent to assess the ridge returned with fragmentary reports describing extensive fortifications, but those reports were discounted as exaggeration by men who wanted to believe the assault would succeed. The result was an operational plan based on false assumptions about enemy strength, assumptions that would cost German forces dearly when reality imposed itself. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, on December 21st, final attack orders were issued to assault units. Officers gathered their men and explained the mission with varying degrees of honesty, depending on their assessment of morale and commitment. Some officers emphasized the strategic importance of Elsenborn Ridge, framing the attack as the key to breaking the northern shoulder and accessing the roads to the Meuse. Others focused on duty and obedience, reminding their soldiers that orders existed to be obeyed regardless of personal opinion. A few officers, veterans who'd seen too many attacks fail, simply told their men to stay together, support each other, and do their duty. The soldiers listened with the varied reactions of men facing combat, some eager, some terrified, most simply resigned to whatever came next. They cleaned weapons, checked ammunition, and prepared themselves mentally for an assault they understood would be costly, regardless of outcome. Dawn, December 21st, 1944. A forward observer from the 37th Field Artillery Battalion watched through binoculars as German forces assembled in tree lines below Elsenborn Ridge, their movement visible despite camouflage attempts because trained observers knew what to look for. He counted infantry by company, estimated armor by the sound of engines carrying across frozen ground, and began calling coordinates to the Fire Direction Center, with the professional calm of a man reporting weather rather than preparing to kill hundreds of people. The Fire Direction Center received his coordinates, calculated firing data for 12 artillery battalions, and began the synchronization that would bring 192 guns to bear on a target area measuring roughly 1 square mile. This was artillery employment at an industrial scale, the transformation of individual guns into a system capable of delivering destruction, measured in tons per minute. The German assault force formed in the pre-dawn darkness, soldiers moving into attack positions with the mechanical efficiency of men executing familiar drills. Company commanders synchronize watches, confirm radio frequencies, and receive final instructions from battalion commanders who tried to project confidence they didn't entirely feel. The plan called for infantry to advance under artillery preparation, with armor following to exploit any breakthrough the infantry achieved. German artillery, far weaker than American concentrations because shells were scarce and guns had been prioritized for other sectors, would fire for 20 minutes before the assault began. It was a conventional plan executed by unconventional soldiers, SS troops, whose fanaticism was supposed to compensate for material disadvantages and tactical problems. At 7 o'clock, German artillery began its preparatory fires, shells landing on and around Elsenborn Ridge in quantities insufficient to suppress American positions, but enough to announce the attack's commencement. American soldiers crouched in their fighting positions, enduring the bombardment with the stoicism of veterans who understood artillery was frightening, but statistically unlikely to kill them if they stayed low and kept their heads down. Forward observers continued calling coordinates despite the German fire, maintaining radio communication with artillery units and refining target data as German forces became visible emerging from the tree lines. The observers understood they were the critical link in the system, that their ability to see and communicate would determine whether American artillery achieved its potential or simply threw shells into empty ground. The first American artillery shells landed at 7:15, 5 minutes after German infantry left the tree line and began advancing across open ground toward the ridge. The initial rounds were adjustments, observers correcting fall of shot, and refining coordinates to ensure maximum effectiveness. Then the full weight of 12 battalions arrived, then 192 guns firing in coordinated salvos that turned the approach to Elsenborn Ridge into a zone where survival became a matter of chance rather than skill. Shells burst in air bursts that scattered steel fragments across wide areas, killing exposed infantry. Shells detonated on impact, creating craters and concussion that disoriented survivors. And the shells kept coming, 4 rounds per gun per minute. Nearly 800 shells every minute landing in an area where German forces had nowhere to hide. German infantry attempting to advance through American artillery fire experienced conditions that no training could prepare them for. The ground erupted continuously, explosions overlapping so closely that individual detonations merged into sustained roar. Shrapnel filled the air. An invisible death moving at supersonic speeds that killed before sound registered. Concussion from nearby impacts knocked men down. Ruptured eardrums created internal injuries that killed without visible wounds. Soldiers who'd survived the Eastern Front described this as worse than anything they'd experienced at Stalingrad or Kursk. Artillery concentrated in quantities that exceeded even Russian bombardments. Units trying to maintain formation disintegrated as men sought any cover, any depression in the ground that might provide shelter from the metal storm falling from the sky. German armor attempted to support the infantry assault, Panthers moving forward to provide covering fire and intimidate American defenders with the psychological effect of heavy tanks. But the open approach to Elsenborn Ridge negated the Panthers' armor advantage, nay, exposing them to American tank destroyers and anti-tank guns, firing from prepared positions at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. A Panther died to a 90mm anti-tank round that penetrated its frontal armor, something American guns had struggled to do at shorter ranges, but which the long-range shot made possible. Another Panther fell to a mine the crew never saw, the explosion destroying a track and leaving the tank immobile where American artillery could target it at leisure. By 8 o'clock, 6 Panthers burned on the approaches to Elsenborn Ridge, their crews dead inside or fled, and the psychological effect reversed as German infantry watched their armored support destroyed. At 10 o'clock, the German assault had gained perhaps 200 yards at the cost of an estimated 800 casualties. And commanders faced the decision of whether to continue or withdraw. Military logic demanded withdrawal because the attack had clearly failed, but withdrawing meant admitting failure and facing the consequences that admission would bring. Some units continued attacking through sheer momentum, officers driving their men forward because stopping to think meant confronting the futility of their actions. Other units simply dissolved as soldiers sought cover and refused to advance despite threats and appeals to duty. A German captain later described standing in a crater, screaming orders that nobody followed, watching his company disintegrate around him while American artillery maintained its methodical destruction. December 22nd brought another assault with similar results. German forces attacked, American artillery destroyed them, and the calculus of casualties versus ground gained demonstrated the mathematical impossibility of breaking the Elsenborn defense through frontal assault. The German attacks became ritualistic, repetitive demonstrations that will couldn't overcome firepower. That courage died just as easily as cowardice under concentrated artillery fire. American gunners settled into industrial rhythms, firing thousands of rounds daily until gun barrels overheated and had to be swabbed with water between fire missions. Supply convoys ran continuously from ammunition depots at Liège, delivering shells faster than the guns could fire them, a demonstration of American logistics that no German formation could match. December 23rd brought a brief clearing in the weather, and with it came American air power that had been grounded since the offensive began. P-47 Thunderbolts appeared over Elsenborn Ridge, their pilots coordinating with ground observers to strike German positions that artillery couldn't reach. The aircraft attacked with bombs, rockets, and machine guns, adding aerial destruction to the artillery fire that had already turned the approaches to Elsenborn into a killing ground. German soldiers, accustomed to having air superiority, or at least parity during the initial days of the offensive, now experienced what American forces had endured earlier in the war, the helplessness of being attacked from an element you couldn't fight back against. The psychological effect was devastating because it demonstrated that even when weather cooperated, even when visibility allowed air operations. Next to the Americans possessed advantages Germans couldn't overcome. Christmas Eve, December 24th, brought the final German assault against Elsenborn Ridge, an attack launched more from desperation than any realistic hope of success. German forces attacked with diminished strength and broken morale, going through the motions because orders required it, but without the conviction that earlier assaults had possessed. American artillery responded with the same methodical destruction, firing illumination rounds through the night to prevent German movement and maintain continuous observation. By midnight, the assault had failed like all previous attempts, and German commanders began receiving orders to disengage and shift forces south, where the 5th Panzer Army was still achieving limited success. The battle for Elsenborn Ridge was effectively over, decided not by a climactic engagement, but by the cumulative effect of artillery fire that had made German casualties unsustainable. The statistics from December 21st through 26th told the story in numbers that captured nothing of the human cost, but everything of the tactical reality. American artillery fired more than 10,000 rounds per day at peak intensity, with some battalions exhausting their gun barrels and requiring replacement tubes. German casualties exceeded 2,000 killed and wounded, figures compiled from prisoner interrogations and post-battle assessments of German unit strength. American casualties during the same period totaled under 100. That's mostly from German counter-battery fire that was too weak and inaccurate to significantly degrade American artillery. The disparity was so extreme that American officers initially discounted the figures as exaggeration, unable to believe their artillery had achieved such one-sided results until photographic reconnaissance confirmed the devastation visible on the approaches to the ridge. December 23, 1944. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower stood in his headquarters studying a wall map marked with colored pins showing German penetrations into Allied lines. The Bulge was clearly visible, a westward salient that extended 50 miles into Belgium and threatened to split British forces in the north from American forces in the south. Bastogne was encircled, its defenders besieged and famous, and generating hundreds of news reports and becoming the public face of American resistance. But Eisenhower's eyes kept returning to the northern shoulder, where the Bulge stopped abruptly at Elsenborn Ridge, where German advances that had shattered American positions elsewhere had simply ended. An aide briefed him on the situation at Elsenborn, describing the 2nd Infantry Division's defense in professional military language that conveyed success without drama. Eisenhower asked a single question: how long can they hold? The aide's answer was immediate and confident. Indefinitely, sir, barring a major shift in German strategy. The strategic geography of the Ardennes offensive hinged on road networks more than any other factor, or because modern mechanized armies moved on roads, and the Ardennes offered few good routes through its forests and steep valleys. Elsenborn Ridge controlled the northern road network, specifically the routes through Malmedy to Spa and beyond to Liège. Those roads mattered because Spa contained a major Allied headquarters and significant supply depots, while Liège was a critical logistics hub where supplies flowed from Antwerp to support the entire Allied advance. If German forces captured those roads, they could unhinge the northern shoulder, access fuel and supplies they desperately needed, and create the operational breakthrough that Hitler's plan required. The 2nd Infantry Division's defense at Elsenborn prevented all of this, not through dramatic action, but through the simple negative achievement of not losing. On December 24th, brought British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery to temporary command of Allied forces north of the German penetration, a command arrangement that would create political friction, but which Eisenhower judged necessary for tactical coordination. Montgomery studied the situation with his characteristic thoroughness and immediately recognized Elsenborn Ridge's importance, ordering that the 2nd Infantry Division receive priority for replacements, ammunition, and any other support they required. A British liaison officer visiting the ridge on December 25th reported back to Montgomery that the Americans held strong positions and showed no signs of wavering. Montgomery, never generous with praise for American forces, acknowledged in his report to Eisenhower that the defense at Elsenborn represented professional military performance of the highest quality. Christmas Day, December 25, 1944, brought a strange quiet to Elsenborn Ridge as both sides observed an informal ceasefire without any official agreement. American soldiers in their fighting positions received hot meals brought forward from field kitchens, the first hot food many had eaten in 9 days. Some units held brief religious services in bunkers or basements, chaplains offering prayers for the dead and comfort for the living. German forces, equally exhausted and increasingly aware that their offensive had failed to achieve its objectives, used the respite to evacuate wounded and reorganize units that had been shattered by American artillery. The Christmas ceasefire lasted perhaps 12 hours before sporadic firing resumed, but those 12 hours allowed both sides to step back from the immediacy of combat and assess the larger situation. The comparison between Bastogne and Elsenborn revealed how military significance and public recognition often diverge. Bastogne, surrounded and besieged, generated dramatic narratives that newspapers could sell and readers could understand. Brave defenders holding out against overwhelming odds, supplies dropped by parachute, the famous nuts reply to German surrender demands. Elsenborn Ridge generated no similar stories because success doesn't create drama, because defense that works looks unexciting from the outside, and because reporters couldn't reach the ridge to witness the fighting firsthand. A 2nd Infantry Division soldier later complained that Bastogne got all the glory despite suffering fewer casualties and facing less sustained pressure than Elsenborn's defenders had endured. The complaint was accurate but irrelevant because history remembers drama more than effectiveness. By December 26th, Allied intelligence had compiled enough information to assess the German offensive's strategic failure with confidence. The 6th Panzer Army, responsible for the northern thrust and the capture of critical objectives around Liège, had achieved essentially nothing beyond creating a small salient east of Elsenborn Ridge. The 5th Panzer Army in the center had penetrated deeper, creating the bulge that gave the battle its name. But had failed to capture Bastogne and was increasingly constrained by American forces squeezing the salient from north and south. The 7th Army in the south had made minimal progress against stiffening American resistance. Hitler's gamble had failed, not through any single dramatic defeat, but through the cumulative effect of American resistance at dozens of points, of which Elsenborn was among the most significant. The assessment of German casualties at Elsenborn revealed the human cost of the 6th Panzer Army's failure. Intelligence officers estimated 4,500 German killed, wounded, or missing in attacks against the ridge between December 21st and 26th. Casualties suffered for zero territorial gain and no strategic advantage. The 12th SS Panzer Division, the elite troops who had fought with savage effectiveness in Normandy, had been reduced to combat ineffectiveness, requiring withdrawal and reconstitution. Other divisions committed to the Elsenborn sector showed similar degradation, their combat power consumed in attacks that tactical reality had doomed before they began. The casualty figures, when compared to the minimal American losses during the same period, demonstrated what military theorists already knew. Attacking prepared positions defended by competent troops and supported by adequate artillery was nearly impossible without overwhelming numerical superiority. December the 28th brought the first indications that German forces were beginning to shift south, abandoning the Elsenborn sector to concentrate what remained of their offensive capability against the 5th Panzer Army's salient. American intelligence detected the movement through prisoner interrogations, signals, intercepts, and the simple observation that German artillery fire around Elsenborn had decreased significantly. The movement confirmed what the 2nd Infantry Division's defenders had achieved. They had broken the German offensive in the north so completely that enemy forces were abandoning the sector as hopeless. The victory was absolute but would remain largely unrecognized, a footnote to the more famous battles at Bastogne and the eventual Allied counteroffensive. The broader strategic implications of Elsenborn Ridge's defense became clear in the weeks following the German offensive's failure. Because the northern shoulder had held, American forces could concentrate their counteroffensive efforts against the Bulge's flanks without worrying about German breakthrough in the north. Because the roads through Malmedy and Spa remained in Allied hands, logistics continued flowing to support both defensive operations and the eventual counterattack. Because the 6th Panzer Army had been defeated at Elsenborn, German reserves that might have reinforced success elsewhere had been consumed in attacks that achieved nothing. The defense had been strategically decisive in ways that wouldn't be fully appreciated until historians examined the battle with decades of perspective. Eisenhower's final assessment of the Ardennes offensive, delivered to his staff on December 31st, acknowledged Elsenborn Ridge's importance while recognizing that public attention had focused elsewhere. He noted in his diary that several actions during the battle deserved more recognition than they had received, and listed the 2nd Infantry Division's defense among them. But he also understood that military effectiveness and public recognition operated on different tracks, that the divisions which held their ground without drama would receive less attention than those which created compelling narratives. The 2nd Infantry Division would receive a Presidential Unit citation for their performance during the Bulge, formal recognition that meant much to the soldiers who'd fought there, but which reached few beyond the military community. June 8, 1944, Omaha Beach, Normandy. And men of the 2nd Infantry Division waded through surf still red with blood from the previous day's assault, stepping over debris and bodies that marked the most costly beach landing in American military history. The division hadn't participated in D-Day itself, but arrived as follow-on forces, tasked with exploiting the tenuous beachhead that the first wave had purchased with catastrophic casualties. For most soldiers in the division, Omaha Beach was their introduction to combat, their first experience of war's reality, as opposed to training simulation. They learned lessons that couldn't be taught in any classroom: the sound of incoming artillery, the sight of friends dying, the physical sensation of fear so intense it became a presence rather than an emotion. These lessons would be expensive, and paid for with the lives of men who didn't survive long enough to apply what they had learned. But the survivors absorbed knowledge that would prove invaluable 6 months later at Elsenborn Ridge. September 1944. Brest, France. The 2nd Infantry Division attacked German fortifications that had been designed to resist naval bombardment. Centuries-old walls enhanced with modern concrete and steel. The siege became an education in urban combat, house-to-house fighting, where every building was a fortress and every street a killing ground. Soldiers learned how to clear rooms without exposing themselves to crossfire, how to use tank destroyers to reduce fortified positions, how to coordinate infantry and artillery in terrain where friendly fire was an ever-present danger. The lessons were written in casualties, at 7,000 men killed or wounded over 6 weeks. But the survivors emerged as combat veterans who understood urban warfare at a level no training exercise could replicate. When the 2nd Division fought at Krinkelt Rocherath in December, they drew on knowledge purchased at Brest, applying hard-won experience to the immediate problem of defending villages against German armor. December 16, 1944, the Ardennes. The 2nd Infantry Division responded to the German offensive with reflexes honed through 9 months of continuous combat, while the 99th Infantry Division, green troops with zero combat experience, struggled with decisions that veterans made instinctively. The difference appeared immediately in small details that accumulated into operational significance. Veteran units maintained communications discipline despite the chaos, radio operators transmitting essential information without cluttering nets with unnecessary traffic. Green units flooded radio frequencies with panicked reports, fragmentary information, and requests for instructions that headquarters couldn't provide because they couldn't hear essential traffic through the noise. Veteran soldiers established hasty defensive positions using terrain they'd never seen before, applying principles they'd learned through trial and error in France. Green soldiers needed explicit instructions for every action, freezing when those instructions didn't arrive or arrived too late to matter. The casualty statistics from the first 48 hours of the German offensive revealed the veteran advantage in stark numbers. Nice 2nd Infantry Division units, despite facing elite German forces in the initial assault, maintained cohesion and suffered casualties at rates roughly half those of adjacent 99th Division positions. The difference wasn't courage, because green troops often fought with reckless bravery born from not yet understanding what could kill them. The difference was competence, the 1,000 small skills that veterans possessed without conscious thought. Reading terrain for covered approaches, recognizing incoming artillery early enough to seek shelter, coordinating with adjacent units without waiting for orders. These skills couldn't be taught effectively in training because they required the particular focus that comes from understanding that mistakes mean death. Bold leadership continuity gave the 2nd Division advantages that extended beyond individual soldier competence. Most battalion and company commanders had led their units since Normandy, developing relationships with subordinates, an understanding of their capabilities that couldn't be replicated quickly. These commanders knew which lieutenants could be trusted with independent action and which needed detailed supervision. They understood their soldiers' limits, how much combat stress units could endure before cohesion degraded, and they'd developed informal networks for solving problems that formal chains of command couldn't address quickly enough. When the German offensive fragmented American forces into isolated pockets, these informal networks allowed 2nd Division units to coordinate actions that doctrine said required higher headquarters direction. The 2nd Division's relationship with supporting artillery exemplified how experience created effectiveness that no amount of training could replicate. The division had worked with the same artillery battalions for months, developing procedures for calling fire that existed more as shared understanding than written doctrine. Forward observers knew individual battery commanders, understood which units had the most accurate fire, and which responded fastest to urgent requests. Fire direction centers knew which infantry companies would provide the best target information and which needed more guidance. This accumulated knowledge meant the 2nd Division could employ artillery with precision and speed that astonished even experienced German officers, who later described American artillery coordination as the most effective they'd encountered on any front. The replacement challenge confronted every unit that sustained casualties over extended periods: how to maintain veteran effectiveness while absorbing soldiers who lacked combat experience. The 2nd Division had taken 7,000 casualties before the Bulge began, losses that had been replaced by soldiers fresh from training in the United States. These replacements, arriving in 1s and 2s rather than complete units, were mentored by veterans who taught them survival skills in the brief periods between combat operations. A replacement joining a veteran squad learned where to position himself during artillery barrages, how to spot German infiltration attempts, how to stay alive through the first terrifying days when everything seemed designed to kill him. The informal mentorship wasn't perfect and couldn't prevent all replacement casualties, but it transmitted essential knowledge much faster than formal training programs. German forces, particularly the 12th SS Panzer Division, brought their own extensive combat experience to the Ardennes, having fought since Normandy and before that on the Eastern Front. But their experience was primarily offensive, exploiting breakthrough and pursuing retreating enemies, operations that rewarded aggression and speed. The defense at Elsenborn required different skills: patience, fire discipline, the coordination of defensive fires, willingness to trade space for casualties. German units struggled to adapt their offensive experience to defensive requirements, continuing to attack when operational logic demanded they acknowledge failure and disengage. The German veteran advantage, considerable in operations that matched their experience, proved less valuable when confronted with operational requirements their training and experience hadn't emphasized. The 99th Division's performance during the Bulge, while less effective than 2nd Division's, improved dramatically over the first week as survivors gained experience through the terrible teaching method of combat. Units that had panicked and broken on December 16th held together on December 20th, applying lessons they had learned at awful cost. Company commanders who'd frozen during initial German attacks made competent tactical decisions by the battle's end, their education compressed into days rather than months, but effective nonetheless. The improvement demonstrated that experience could be gained quickly under pressure, but it also showed why veteran divisions were so valuable. The 2nd Division had purchased its experience over 9 months and 7,000 casualties, while the 99th gained equivalent knowledge in 1 week, at the cost of unit cohesion and significantly higher casualty rates. The veteran difference at Elsenborn Ridge wasn't dramatic or easily captured in headlines, but it was decisive. Veteran soldiers made correct decisions instinctively when green soldiers needed time to think. And that time difference determined whether defensive positions held or broke. Veteran units coordinated complex maneuvers under a fire, while green units struggled with basic tasks. Veteran leaders inspired confidence through demonstrated competence, while green leaders fought their own fear and uncertainty. The cumulative effect of these differences, multiplied across thousands of individual decisions and actions, meant the 2nd Infantry Division could accomplish what doctrine said was nearly impossible: transition from offense to defense while in contact with the enemy, establish positions under fire, and defeat attacks by numerically superior forces. Experience wasn't everything in warfare, but at Elsenborn Ridge it was nearly everything, the factor that separated success from catastrophe. December 18th, 1944. At Krinkelt, Belgium. Staff Sergeant Stanley Larson watched his platoon leader fall dead in the middle of the crossroads his company was supposed to defend. Shot by a German sniper nobody could locate. Larson was 24 years old, a farmer's son from Iowa who'd been in the Army since 1942 and in combat since Normandy. He'd never wanted to be a leader, had been perfectly content as a squad leader, following orders rather than giving them. But the dead lieutenant had been the last officer in the company, and somebody needed to organize the defense. Larson took command with no formal authority, except the informal respect his soldiers gave him, positioned his remaining men to cover the approaches to the crossroads, and settled in to hold ground that military logic suggested he should abandon. For the next 6 hours, Larson's improvised platoon fought off 3 German attacks, calling artillery fire so close to their own positions that shells landed within 50 yards. When relief finally arrived after dark, Larson was still at the crossroads, surrounded by dead Germans and low on ammunition, but holding the position his lieutenant had died trying to defend. Private First Class Richard Cowan was a medic with the 9th Infantry Regiment, trained to provide first aid, but not prepared for the sustained casualty flow that Rocherath generated. Cowan established an aid station in a basement on December the 17th, treating wounded men as they were brought in from fighting that never seemed to stop. By December 18th, he'd run out of most medical supplies and was improvising with whatever materials he could scavenge: bed sheets torn into bandages, Belgian civilian coats used as blankets, alcohol meant for drinking repurposed as antiseptic. What he couldn't improvise was morphine for pain or plasma for shock, supplies that required evacuation to rear area medical facilities. So, Cowan made 12 trips from his basement aid station to the battalion aid station 500 yards away, carrying wounded men on his back through streets under German fire. He was shot at on every trip, saw 3 other medics killed attempting similar evacuations, and continued anyway because wounded men would die if he stopped. On his final trip, carrying a soldier with a sucking chest wound who would die without immediate surgery, Cowan was wounded by shrapnel that tore through his leg and ended his war. The soldier he was carrying survived. And Technical Sergeant Jose Mendez Lopez was a machine gunner with the 23rd Infantry Regiment, a Mexican-American soldier from Texas who joined the Army in 1942 and fought through France with quiet competence that earned respect but not recognition. On December 20th, Lopez's company established defensive positions on the approach to Elsenborn Ridge, and he positioned his machine gun to cover the most likely German avenue of approach. The attack came at dawn on December 21st, German infantry advancing in strength that should have overwhelmed the American position. Lopez's squad abandoned their position when German fire became too intense, falling back to secondary positions. But Lopez stayed with his gun because somebody needed to slow the German advance. For the next hour, Lopez fired his machine gun in sustained bursts that Army manuals said would melt the barrel, targeting German soldiers at ranges where he could see their faces. When his ammunition ran out, he continued fighting with a rifle taken from a dead soldier, then grenades, then his rifle as a club when Germans reached his position. When American reinforcements counterattacked and recaptured the position, they found Lopez unconscious but alive, surrounded by more than 100 dead German soldiers. He would receive the Medal of Honor, the only 2nd Division soldier to earn that recognition during the Battle of the Bulge. Lieutenant Robert McDonald was an artillery forward observer, 23 years old, and responsible for directing fire from a battalion of howitzers positioned on Elsenborn Ridge. From December 21st through December 24th, McDonald occupied an observation post in a church steeple, watching German forces assemble for attacks and calling coordinates that transformed his observations into artillery fire. He worked 72 continuous hours with minimal sleep, sustained by coffee and the professional satisfaction of seeing his fire missions destroy German attacks before they reached American lines. German forces identified his observation post and subjected it to sustained counter-battery fire that progressively destroyed the church around him, but MacDonald stayed because abandoning the position would blind the artillery he directed. On December 24th, a German shell collapsed part of the steeple, and MacDonald fell 30 feet to the church floor, breaking both legs and ending his war. But the 3 days of fire missions he'd called had prevented German breakthrough, channeling attacks into killing grounds and making the defense of Elsenborn Ridge possible through the simple negative achievement of destroying enemy forces before they could close with American positions. Combat engineers fought at Elsenborn Ridge with tools instead of rifles, but their contribution was equally essential to the defense. Sergeant Thomas O'Brien commanded an engineer squad tasked with demolitions, preparing charges on buildings and bridges that would deny them to German forces if the defense failed. O'Brien positioned his demolitions with the careful precision of a man who understood that premature detonation would kill American soldiers while delayed detonation would gift infrastructure to the enemy. On December 19th, O'Brien held the trigger for demolitions in Krinkelt's main street, waiting for the last American soldiers to clear before destroying buildings. A wounded soldier, unable to walk, was being carried by 2 medics moving slower than the planned timeline allowed. O'Brien held the trigger, watching German forces close on the retreating Americans, calculating whether to blow the charges and kill friendly soldiers or wait and risk German capture of intact buildings. He waited, the last Americans cleared with perhaps 30 seconds to spare, and O'Brien detonated his charges knowing his decision had endangered the broader defense to save 3 men. The buildings collapsed, denying them to German forces, and nobody except O'Brien and the soldiers he had saved knew how close the decision had been. The statistical reality of the Elsenborn defense was that roughly 40% of 2nd Division casualties during the battle were junior non-commissioned officers and lieutenants, the soldiers who led from the front and paid the price for that leadership. These were the men who made immediate tactical decisions, who inspired soldiers through example rather than rank, who died in disproportionate numbers because leadership required visibility, and visibility invited death. A rifle company that entered the Bulge with 3 officers and 12 sergeants often ended the battle with 1 officer and 4 sergeants, the rest dead or wounded. The soldiers who stepped into leadership roles when the formal leaders fell were farmers and clerks and mechanics, and men who'd never imagined commanding anything larger than a squad, but who rose to requirements because the alternative was organizational collapse. The awards and decorations given for actions at Elsenborn Ridge reflected military bureaucracy's attempt to recognize individual heroism through standardized categories. The 2nd Infantry Division received over 400 silver stars and 1,200 bronze stars for actions during the Battle of the Bulge, medals that came with brief citations describing acts of courage in language so generic it failed to capture the specific terror and determination each award represented. Jose Lopez's Medal of Honor came with national publicity and formal ceremony, a recognition that meant much to his family and community, but which Lopez himself viewed with the complicated emotions of a survivor who'd watched friends die performing equally courageous actions that received no recognition. Most decorations were presented in small ceremonies weeks or months after the battle, when the immediacy of what had been accomplished had faded and medals felt like inadequate compensation for friends who weren't present to receive their own. Post-war obscurity claimed most of the individual stories from Elsenborn Ridge, as it claims most military actions that succeed without drama. Stanley Larson returned to Iowa and farming, rarely discussing his 6 hours commanding the Krinkelt crossroads because his neighbors couldn't understand and didn't need the burden of his memories. Richard Cowan recovered from his wounds and worked construction in Ohio. The 12 evacuation runs through German fire reduced to a single sentence in his obituary 60 years later. Jose Lopez became a veteran's advocate, his Medal of Honor giving him a platform to speak for soldiers whose heroism earned less recognition. Robert MacDonald taught mathematics at a small college, occasionally mentioning his artillery service to students, but never describing the 72 hours in the church steeple, These men and thousands like them carried Elsenborn Ridge silently, the memory too complex for casual conversation and too important to forget. The unnamed soldiers, the ones who performed adequately rather than heroically, and therefore earned no recognition beyond survival, constituted the bulk of Elsenborn's defenders, and deserved recognition that history couldn't provide because their actions generated no records. The rifleman who held his position when every instinct screamed to run. The machine gunner who maintained fire discipline, shooting only when he had clear targets rather than panicking and wasting ammunition. The radio operator who maintained communications despite fear and fatigue. The cook who became a rifleman, the clerk who carried ammunition forward, the driver who evacuated wounded under fire. These soldiers made the defense possible through collective competence rather than individual heroism, and their contribution was simultaneously essential and invisible to any historical record that focused on dramatic actions rather than sustained professional performance. December 16th, 1944, Krinkelt, Belgium. An American rifleman chambered a round into his M1 Garand, the distinctive ping of the loading clip, marking him as carrying a weapon that would define the infantry battle at Elsenborn Ridge. The M1 Garand was a semi-automatic rifle, capable of firing 8 rounds as fast as the soldier could pull the trigger, a dramatic advantage over the German Karabiner 98 bolt-action rifle that required manual cycling between shots. In the close quarters fighting at Krinkelt Rocherath, this difference translated to American soldiers achieving twice the rate of fire of their German counterparts, a multiplicative advantage that partially offset German numerical superiority. The Garand wasn't perfect. The 8-round clip couldn't be partially reloaded, or forcing soldiers to fire all rounds before reloading, even if they had only used a few. But in urban combat where engagements lasted seconds and happened at ranges measured in yards, the Garand's semi-automatic action gave American infantry a decisive edge. The bazooka teams operating in Krinkelt demonstrated both the potential and limitations of American anti-tank weapons. The bazooka, formerly designated as the M1A1 rocket launcher, fired a 2.36-inch rocket theoretically capable of penetrating German tank armor at ranges up to 300 yards. In practice, the bazooka struggled against Panther frontal armor unless the crew achieved a perfect 90-degree hit, and even side shots sometimes failed to penetrate if the angle was poor. But in the stone villages, gold bazooka teams could position themselves in second-story windows or concealed positions that allowed shots into thinner top or rear armor. A bazooka team from the 38th Infantry destroyed 3 Panthers on December 18th by firing from a bakery's second floor, hitting each tank in the engine compartment where armor was thinnest. The tactic required nerve because Panthers could level buildings with single shells if they spotted the launch signature, but it worked often enough to keep German armor cautious and slow. American artillery represented the critical advantage that made the Elsenborn defense possible, an advantage measured not in individual gun superiority, but in systematic employment that German forces couldn't match. The M114 155mm howitzer, the backbone of American divisional artillery, could fire 4 rounds per minute sustained and maintain that rate for hours because American logistics ensured continuous ammunition supply. The gun's range of 14,000 yards meant batteries positioned on Elsenborn Ridge could reach any point on the approaches, and the Americans had 12 battalions worth of these guns plus lighter pieces. German artillery, by contrast, was scattered across the offensive front, chronically short of ammunition because German logistics couldn't sustain high rates of fire, and unable to concentrate fires because communication systems and doctrine emphasized direct support rather than massed fires. The ammunition supply chain that fed American artillery represented industrial warfare at its most efficient, a system that transformed American manufacturing capacity into battlefield effects. That each artillery battalion required approximately 1,000 rounds daily to sustain combat operations, meaning the 12 battalions supporting Elsenborn consumed 12,000 shells every 24 hours. These shells originated in factories across the United States, were shipped across the Atlantic to depots in Britain, then moved to advanced depots in France and Belgium. From the Liège depot, trucks ran continuous shuttles to artillery positions, delivering shells faster than the guns could fire them, and creating stockpiles that ensured ammunition never became a constraint on operations. A German artillery officer, captured near Elsenborn, expressed amazement at the American ammunition expenditure, noting that his battery had fired fewer shells in 2 weeks than he'd watched American batteries fire in a single day. Radio communications gave American forces coordination capabilities that German units couldn't replicate despite technically superior individual radio sets. The 2nd Infantry Division fielded over 300 radios, ranging from small squad sets to powerful battalion radios capable of reaching division headquarters. This radio density meant every significant unit could communicate directly without relying on wire lines that artillery cut or runners that enemy fire stopped. German forces, by contrast, still depended heavily on wire communications at battalion level and below, a system that worked adequately in static defense but collapsed under the chaos of offensive operations. When American artillery cut German wire lines, German units became isolated and unable to coordinate, and while American forces maintained communications and adjusted operations in real time. The tank and tank destroyer disparity told a complex story about American material advantages and tactical flexibility compensating for inferior individual vehicle performance. The M4 Sherman tank, standard American medium tank, was outgunned and out-armored by German Panthers and Tigers, a disadvantage American tankers understood from bitter experience in France. But the 2nd Division fielded 30 Shermans and 60 M10 and M36 tank destroyers, giving them numerical superiority and tactical options that German armor lacked. Tank destroyers, mounting high-velocity guns on mobile chassis, could engage German tanks from prepared positions at long ranges where their guns penetrated armor that Shermans couldn't defeat. The combination of Shermans for infantry support and tank destroyers for anti-armor missions created a system more effective than either vehicle type alone. Logistics, the unglamorous foundation of military operations, represented America's decisive advantage at Elsenborn Ridge and throughout the European theater. American soldiers never ran short of ammunition, food, fuel, or medical supplies because the logistics system delivered everything they needed and more. A rifle company at Elsenborn received hot meals at least once daily, even during the heaviest fighting, a luxury that German soldiers hadn't experienced in weeks. Medical evacuation removed wounded soldiers from the battlefield within hours, and treating them in well-equipped aid stations before moving them to hospitals, where modern medicine gave them survival rates unimaginable in previous wars. Vehicle maintenance kept American trucks and tanks operational despite brutal winter conditions, because spare parts flowed forward as reliably as ammunition. German forces, by contrast, abandoned tanks for lack of fuel, rationed ammunition to unsustainable levels, and watched soldiers die from treatable wounds because evacuation systems had collapsed. The weapons comparison revealed that American advantages came primarily from quantity and systematic employment, rather than qualitative superiority. German small arms were arguably superior. The MG-42 machine gun fired faster than American equivalents, the Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon was more effective than the bazooka, and German tanks were individually superior to American armor. But the Americans fielded more weapons, supplied them adequately, and employed them within a system that maximized their collective effectiveness. A German soldier with a superior rifle, but 3 magazines of ammunition, was less effective than an American soldier with an adequate rifle and unlimited ammunition. A Panther tank with no fuel was less useful than a Sherman with full tanks and supplies to refuel. Quality mattered, but quantity backed by logistics mattered more. Allied air superiority, grounded during the opening days of the Bulge by heavy overcast, returned on December 23rd and immediately demonstrated its value. P-47. Thunderbolts flying from forward airfields in France attacked German positions around Elsenborn with bombs, rockets, and 850 caliber machine guns that turned trucks and troops into wreckage. The psychological effect exceeded the physical damage because German soldiers, accustomed to operating without air threat during the first week of the offensive, now had to disperse and hide whenever skies cleared. American forward air controllers, working with artillery observers on Elsenborn Ridge, directed strikes with precision that maximized effectiveness and minimized friendly fire risks. The aircraft represented another multiplicative advantage, combining with artillery and small arms to create a defense in depth that German forces couldn't penetrate. The arsenal that defended Elsenborn Ridge was impressive, not because individual weapons were superior, but because American industry and logistics had created a system that delivered overwhelming material advantage to the battlefield. German officers, captured during the battle, consistently expressed amazement not at American tactical skill, but at the sheer quantity of equipment American forces employed. The Americans wasted ammunition, by German standards, firing thousands of shells when hundreds would suffice. But the waste didn't matter because more shells always arrived. They lost tanks and replaced them immediately, while German losses were permanent because no replacements existed. The material advantage was so overwhelming that it compensated for tactical errors, leadership failures, and the confusion inherent in combat. At Elsenborn Ridge, American soldiers fought with the confidence that came from knowing they'd never run out of bullets, never lack artillery support, never be abandoned because logistics failed. That confidence, as much as any weapon, made the defense possible. December 16, 1944, the Ardennes Forest. The thermometer outside 2nd Infantry Division headquarters read 28 degrees Fahrenheit at dawn, cold enough to make breath visible and fingers clumsy, but not yet the killing cold that would define the battle in memory. Soldiers preparing for what they thought would be a routine day pulled on extra layers, wool uniforms under field jackets, gloves that made operating weapons difficult but were necessary to prevent frostbite. The overcast sky hung low and gray. It had promising snow that wouldn't arrive for days, but which cast everything in the particular gloom of northern European winter. This was uncomfortable cold, the kind that made soldiers stamp their feet and complain. But it wasn't yet the enemy that winter would become. That transformation would occur over the next 2 weeks as temperatures dropped, snow fell, and the Ardennes winter demonstrated its capacity to kill as efficiently as German bullets. December 20th brought the first serious cold, temperatures dropping to 15 degrees, with wind that made the actual temperature irrelevant, because wind chill became the measure that mattered. A soldier in a foxhole on Elsenborn Ridge described the cold as a physical presence, something that pressed against him with tangible weight and never relented. Stamping feet became continuous, an unconscious rhythm that soldiers maintained even while sleeping, because stopping meant frostbite. Paper and cardboard, scavenged from ration boxes and ammunition crates, became insulation stuffed into boots and uniforms. Soldiers learned to sleep in shifts, 2 men sharing a foxhole with one sleeping, while the other moved to maintain circulation. The cold transformed simple activities into complex challenges. Eating required thawing frozen rations over small fires, drinking meant melting snow or thawing canteens, and basic hygiene became impossible because water froze before it could be used for washing. The medical consequences of sustained cold appeared in aid stations within days of the German offensive's start. Trench foot, a condition where prolonged exposure to cold and wet destroyed tissue in extremities, or became epidemic among soldiers who'd worn the same wet boots for a week. Medics treated cases where soldiers' feet had turned black from tissue death, knowing that many would require amputation, but lacking the facilities to perform surgery that complex and forward aid stations. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes with democratic ruthlessness, affecting officers and enlisted men equally because cold recognized no rank. By December 25th, the 2nd Infantry Division had evacuated over 500 soldiers for cold weather injuries, casualties that reduced combat strength as effectively as German bullets, but which generated no drama and little recognition. December 23rd brought a weather break that militarily changed everything, while physically changing nothing. The overcast lifted for 3 days, allowing Allied aircraft to operate and providing visual observation ranges that had been impossible during the previous week. But the clearing came with temperatures that dropped below 10 degrees Fahrenheit, cold that made exposed skin painful within minutes and threatened death to wounded soldiers who couldn't maintain body heat. American soldiers welcomed the air support while cursing the cold, understanding that the tactical advantage mattered more than personal comfort, but paying a physical price for that advantage. German soldiers, lacking the logistical support that provided American forces with adequate winter clothing, suffered even more severely, their uniforms designed for moderate European weather rather than the Ardennes' anomalous cold. The winter of 1944 to 1945 was statistically the coldest in decades, a meteorological fact that soldiers didn't need statistics to confirm because their bodies provided all the data necessary. Veterans of the Eastern Front, both German and the few Russian liaison officers with American forces, compared Ardennes conditions to Russia and found them surprisingly similar despite the Ardennes being much further south. The cold was different from Russian cold, wetter, and somehow more penetrating, getting into bones despite layers of clothing and refusing to be driven out even when soldiers found shelter. A lieutenant from the 9th Infantry, writing home weeks after the battle, described the cold as more memorable than combat, all a constant presence that defined existence more completely than the intermittent terror of being shot at. Frozen ground created tactical consequences that affected both sides but advantaged the defense more than the offense. The Americans, digging defensive positions on Elsenborn Ridge, found frozen ground nearly impenetrable to shovels and had to use picks and explosives to create fighting positions. But once created, those positions provided solid footing and drainage that wouldn't exist in mud. German forces attacking across the same frozen ground found no cover in earth too hard to dig, forcing them to advance across open terrain with no possibility of quickly creating protective positions. Tank operations benefited from frozen ground that eliminated the mud which had plagued operations earlier in the campaign. But the same frozen ground created maintenance nightmares as mechanical systems designed for moderate temperatures failed in the extreme cold. Fuel requirements increased dramatically as cold weather forced both sides to run vehicle engines continuously to prevent freezing. American logistics could accommodate the increased fuel consumption, trucks shuttling diesel and gasoline forward as reliably as ammunition. German forces, chronically short of fuel even before cold weather increased demand, faced impossible choices about whether to run engines and waste precious fuel or shut them down and risk vehicles that wouldn't restart when needed. Abandoned German tanks and trucks littered the approaches to Elsenborn Ridge, some destroyed by American fire, but many simply immobilized by cold. Their engines frozen solid because crews lacked fuel to keep them running, or antifreeze to protect cooling systems. The psychological toll of sustained cold exceeded its physical effects, breaking down morale through sheer miserable persistence. Soldiers could endure combat intensity for periods measured in hours or days, could function through fear and exhaustion when they believed the ordeal would end. But cold never ended, never gave any respite, just kept extracting heat and energy and will from men who had none of those things to spare. A chaplain with the 23rd Infantry described soldiers in late December as displaying symptoms of depression that had nothing to do with combat stress and everything to do with cold's grinding persistence. Men became irritable, withdrew into themselves, all lost the social cohesion that made units effective fighting organizations. Officers and sergeants worked to maintain morale through humor, shared suffering, and the promise that spring would eventually arrive. But those promises felt hollow when every day brought cold that seemed permanent. December 30th brought snow that had been threatening since the offensive began, 6 inches overnight that transformed the Ardennes into a Christmas card and a nightmare simultaneously. The snow covered the dead who lay in no man's land between American and German positions, white blankets that softened the visual horror while creating new problems for soldiers who had to move through it. Snow accumulated in fighting positions, requiring constant clearing to maintain fields of fire. It concealed mines and obstacles, and turning simple movement into a deadly gamble. And it reflected what little light existed, creating a twilight landscape where distance and depth became impossible to judge accurately. But the snow also revealed movement, German forces advancing across white fields showing as dark shapes that American observers could spot at extreme ranges, negating some of the concealment advantages that attackers normally enjoyed. Wounded soldiers face particular horror in winter conditions because cold killed injured men faster than their wounds would. A soldier hit by shrapnel in moderate weather might survive for hours waiting for evacuation, his body maintaining temperature well enough to sustain life. The same wound in December, cold meant death within an hour as the body diverted heat to vital organs, and extremities cooled below survivability. EA's medics worked frantically to evacuate wounded before cold killed them, but evacuation routes under fire meant some wounded lay exposed for hours, screaming for help that couldn't reach them in time. The survivors carried memories of friends who died not from their wounds, but from cold, a particularly cruel death that seemed worse somehow than being killed instantly in combat. By January 1st, 1945, when the acute phase of fighting at Elsenborn Ridge had ended, soldiers assessed the winter as enemy, equal to the Germans. More 2nd Division soldiers had been evacuated for cold weather injuries than for combat wounds during the latter stages of the battle, a statistic that captured nothing of the suffering but everything of winter's effectiveness as a weapon. You see, the soldiers who remained in the line were those whose bodies had somehow adapted to sustained cold, who'd learned the 1,000 small techniques that meant survival, sleeping in shifts, maintaining circulation, layering clothing effectively, eating constantly to fuel body heat. They'd survived combat and winter both, a double victory that left them exhausted, damaged, and grimly proud of having endured what weaker men couldn't. December 26, 1944. Dawn. A German soldier from the 12th SS Panzer Division watched from a forward position as his unit began withdrawing from positions it had fought 3 days to capture. The withdrawal orders had arrived overnight, terse radio messages directing forces to disengage and shift south, where the 5th Panzer Army was supposedly achieving better results. The soldier didn't need orders to understand what the withdrawal meant. The northern offensive had failed. Elsenborn Ridge would remain in American hands, and the roads to Malmedy and Spa would stay closed to German forces. He'd watched hundreds of his comrades die attacking those roads, had participated in assaults that achieved nothing except casualty lists. And now the withdrawal rendered all that sacrifice pointless. The retreat was orderly, professional even, but it carried the bitter taste of defeat, made worse by the knowledge that defeat had been obvious to every soldier days before commanders acknowledged it. American patrols from Elsenborn Ridge, moving cautiously into positions German forces had occupied hours earlier, found evidence of the battle's human cost scattered across frozen ground. Bodies lay where they'd fallen, as German dead, frozen in the positions where artillery or small arms had killed them, their bodies preserved by cold and tableaus of violence that photographers would later document. Abandoned equipment littered the landscape. Rifles dropped by fleeing soldiers, machine guns left behind because crews lacked the strength to carry them, ammunition that German logistics couldn't resupply. A lieutenant from the 38th Infantry, examining abandoned German positions, found a diary written by an SS soldier who described the attacks on Elsenborn as worse than anything at Kursk, a comparison that gave context to the artillery's effectiveness. The 6th Panzer Army headquarters, located in a commandeered Belgian mansion 20 miles behind the failed offensive, and compiled reports on December 27th that documented the Northern Thrust's complete failure in clinical military language. 4 divisions had been committed to breaking through at Elsenborn: the 12th SS Panzer, 3rd Panzer Grenadier, 277th Volksgrenadier, and 12th Volksgrenadier. Those divisions had advanced between 5 and 8 miles from their start lines, captured 2 villages that were now ruins, and killed perhaps 2,000 American soldiers. German casualties exceeded 4,500 killed and wounded. Tank losses approached 100 vehicles, and the division's combat effectiveness had degraded to the point where they required weeks of reconstitution before they could conduct offensive operations again. The report noted these facts without editorial comment, because staff officers understood that commenting on failure was dangerous when that failure reflected Hitler's personal strategy. Meanwhile, in the southern and central sectors of the Bulge, German forces had achieved the penetration that had eluded them in the north, advancing up to 50 miles and creating the bulge that would give the battle its name. But those advances, dramatic on maps, had failed to achieve strategic objectives because the northern shoulder at Elsenborn had held. The roads through Malmedy and Spa remained in American hands, denying German forces the direct route to the Meuse River. Fuel depots at Spa, which German planning had counted on capturing to sustain the advance, continued supplying American forces. And perhaps most critically, The 6th Panzer Army's failure at Elsenborn freed American forces that could now concentrate against the Bulge's flanks, without worrying about German breakthrough in the north. December 28th brought captured German documents to American intelligence officers, papers that revealed the offensive's ambitious scope and the critical role Elsenborn Ridge had played in defeating it. The documents showed that 6th Panzer Army was supposed to reach the Meuse River by December 22nd, a timeline that required breaking through Elsenborn no later than December 18th. Instead, German forces had been stopped at Krinkelt Rocherath, held at Elsenborn Ridge, and were now withdrawing, having achieved none of their objectives. An intelligence major, reading these documents, already calculated that the 6th Panzer Army was 6 days behind schedule and 60 miles short of objectives, delays, and shortfalls that had given American forces time to reinforce the Meuse bridges and organize coherent defenses. The northern failure had doomed the entire offensive, regardless of German success elsewhere. January 1st, 1945, brought perspective that the chaos of combat had obscured. The 2nd Infantry Division's positions showed no significant change from where they had stopped the German advance on December 20th, a static front line that represented strategic victory despite appearing tactically defensive. American forces held every position they had occupied 2 weeks earlier, had prevented German access to critical roads, and had destroyed significant German combat power in the process. As that the cost had been substantial, 2,000 casualties including 500 dead. But the achievement exceeded any reasonable expectation for a division surprised by the largest German offensive of the war. A regimental commander, touring positions on January 1st, remarked to his staff that they had accomplished something that would be studied in military academies, though he doubted they'd receive recognition proportional to their achievement. The strategic metrics told a story of German failure so complete that even Nazi propaganda struggled to present it as anything other than defeat. The 6th Panzer Army had been tasked with achieving breakthrough in the north, capturing Liège, and cutting Allied supply lines. It had achieved none of these objectives, had suffered crippling casualties, and had been forced to withdraw after 10 days of sustained attacks. The offensive as a whole had created a salient into American lines, but had captured no strategic objectives, secured no critical infrastructure, and exhausted German reserves that couldn't be replaced. German forces were now vulnerable to Allied counteroffensive, had shortened their defensive lines negligibly despite the territorial gains, and had demonstrated to Allied commanders that German military capability had degraded to the point where such offensives were possible to defeat with existing forces. Human cost calculations, compiled by casualty collection points and aid stations, revealed the price both sides had paid for the fight at Elsenborn. American casualties totaled approximately 2,000 killed, wounded, and missing, all concentrated heavily in the infantry units that had done the close-quarters fighting at Krinkelt Rocherath. German casualties exceeded 4,500, a ratio of more than 2-to-1 that reflected both American defensive advantages and the terrible effectiveness of concentrated artillery. But numbers failed to capture the reality of men who died in freezing foxholes, who'd been blown apart by artillery they never saw coming, who'd frozen to death from wounds that might have been survivable in moderate weather. The casualty lists were names and numbers in official reports, but each name represented a family that would receive a telegram and a life that had ended in Belgian snow. The captured German tank that American soldiers examined on January 2nd told its own story about why the 6th Panzer Army had failed. The Panther had been abandoned 5 miles from its start line, intact and undamaged by enemy fire, simply out of fuel and unable to move. Its crew had removed personal equipment and walked away, leaving a 75-ton vehicle worth more than most German soldiers would earn in a lifetime. Inside the tank, investigators found empty fuel cans, documents showing the crew had been on half rations for 3 days, and a maintenance log indicating mechanical problems that couldn't be repaired because spare parts weren't available. The Panther represented German offensive capability in microcosm, impressive technology rendered useless by logistics that couldn't sustain operations, individual excellence negated by systemic failure. December 26, 1944, represented the high-water mark of German offensive capability in the West, the point of maximum advance beyond which German forces could not push despite desperate attempts. That high water mark stopped at Elsenborn Ridge not because of any single dramatic action, but because American soldiers had held positions. Artillery had functioned as designed, and logistics had sustained operations while German logistics failed. The date meant nothing to the soldiers who'd fought there, who measured time in terms of survival rather than strategic significance. But historians would later identify December 26th as the moment when Hitler's last gamble failed, when the initiative in the West passed permanently to Allied forces. Yes, man, when the outcome of the war in Europe became mathematically certain, even if fighting would continue for 4 more months. Elsenborn Ridge had been the northern anchor that refused to break, and in refusing had helped doom the entire offensive. January 10th, 1945. A correspondent from Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper, arrived at Elsenborn Ridge to interview soldiers about their role in defeating the German offensive. The correspondent had spent the previous 2 weeks at Bastogne, writing stories about the surrounded defenders and their dramatic relief by Patton's Third Army. Stories that had generated front-page coverage across American newspapers. Now, his editor wanted balance, coverage of other units that had fought during the Bulge. And Elsenborn represented the northern equivalent of Bastogne's southern stand. The correspondent interviewed a dozen soldiers, collected their stories, and wrote an article describing the defense with professional competence. The article ran on page 6 of Stars and Stripes, received no pickup from civilian newspapers, and disappeared into the vast archive of military reporting that the war generated daily. Elsenborn Ridge's moment for recognition had passed, eclipsed by Bastogne's drama, and it would remain obscure for decades. The narrative advantages that made Bastogne famous were absent at Elsenborn Ridge, creating a publicity disparity that had nothing to do with military significance. Bastogne offered drama, encirclement, airlift resupply, the famous nuts reply to German surrender demands, and dramatic relief by armored forces. And these elements created stories that newspaper readers could understand and that editors knew would sell papers. Elsenborn offered professional competence, a fighting withdrawal, prepared defensive positions, and methodical destruction of German attacks through artillery fire. The defense worked so well it appeared almost routine, success that looked unexciting from outside, and generated no dramatic narratives that captured public imagination. A 2nd Division soldier, bitter about the recognition disparity, later complained that, "We won so decisively we made it look easy, and nobody cares about easy victories." 1946 brought Army historians to interview 2nd Division veterans as part of the official campaign history project. The historians, professional military officers, and civilian academics, and recognized Elsenborn's importance immediately, and conducted extensive interviews, collecting testimony from hundreds of soldiers about their experiences. The interview transcripts revealed frustration bordering on anger about lack of recognition. Veterans who felt their sacrifice had been ignored, while other units received presidential unit citations and media attention. A battalion commander told his interviewer that he'd lost 120 men holding Krinkelt Rocherath, and those men deserved to be remembered as much as Bastogne's defenders, who'd become national heroes. The interviewer noted the comment, filed the transcript, and moved on to the next interview, accumulating thousands of pages of testimony that would sit largely unread in Army archives for decades. Stephen Ambrose, researching his 1965 book on D-Day operations, discovered the Elsenborn story almost by accident while reviewing 2nd Infantry Division records. His research notes, preserved in his papers, record his surprise at finding a major battle that had received almost no popular coverage despite clear strategic importance. Ambrose interviewed surviving veterans and wrote several paragraphs about Elsenborn in his book, but the content was cut during editing because it digressed from the Normandy narrative. He returned to the Elsenborn story in later works, giving it more coverage, but by then the historical narrative had solidified around Bastogne as the defining defensive action of the Bulge. Ambrose's notes include a marginal comment questioning why some battles become famous while others remain obscure, a question he never fully answered despite decades of studying military history. The 1990s brought annual reunions of 2nd Division veterans, gatherings that grew smaller each year as age and death reduced attendance. At these reunions, men in their 70s and 80s shared memories of Elsenborn Ridge, reminded each other of friends who hadn't survived, and expressed frustration that their battle remained largely unknown. A veteran attending the 1995 reunion noted that attendance had dropped to 200 from over 1,000 a decade earlier, and that within another 10 years, there would be no one left who'd been there. The reunions served partly as social gatherings, but more fundamentally as memory preservation. Of veterans ensuring that someone besides themselves knew what had happened in Belgian snow 50 years earlier. They understood they were fighting a losing battle against time and public indifference, but they fought it anyway. Modern Elsenborn Ridge is quiet farmland, its wartime significance marked by small monuments that few tourists visit. The twin villages of Krinkelt and Rocherath were rebuilt after the war, modern homes replacing the stone buildings that had been destroyed in the fighting. A Belgian farmer working fields where German soldiers died by the hundreds in December 1944 occasionally unearths artifacts, shell fragments, equipment, sometimes human remains that require notification of military authorities. The ridge itself shows no signs of its military importance, in just rolling farmland producing crops in soil that once soaked up blood. A small American cemetery nearby contains some soldiers who died at Elsenborn, but most were repatriated or buried in larger cemeteries at Ardennes American Cemetery, where their graves provide no indication of where specifically they fell. Tourist traffic to Ardennes battlefields focuses overwhelmingly on Bastogne, where a massive memorial and museum preserve the siege's memory. The Bastogne Museum receives hundreds of thousands of visitors annually, school groups and military historians and veterans making pilgrimage to ground made famous by the battle. Elsenborn Ridge receives perhaps a few hundred visitors yearly, mostly military professionals studying defensive operations or relatives of soldiers who fought there. The visitor disparity reflects public recognition. Bastogne is famous, Elsenborn is obscure, and that obscurity persists despite historical scholarship establishing Elsenborn's strategic importance equaled or exceeded Bastogne's. German perspectives, compiled through post-war interviews and memoirs, consistently identified Elsenborn as the decisive defeat that doomed the Ardennes offensive. German officers, freed from the political constraints that had prevented honesty during the war, described the Elsenborn defense as the most effective they'd encountered on the Western Front. A former SS officer wrote in his memoir that attacking Elsenborn Ridge was the greatest defensive performance his forces had faced in 2 years of combat, praise that meant something coming from a veteran of both Eastern and Western Front fighting. But these German assessments remained buried in German-language memoirs and official histories, rarely translated or incorporated into English-language popular histories that shaped American public understanding of the battle. The strategic analysis consensus that emerged among military historians by the 2000s held that Elsenborn Ridge was more strategically significant than Bastogne, though Bastogne remained more famous. The northern shoulder's stability had prevented German access to the road network that the entire offensive required, had forced German forces to attempt breakthrough in less favorable terrain to the south, and had freed American forces that could then concentrate against the Bulge's flanks. Bastogne's defense was important and dramatic. But Elsenborn's defense was arguably more critical to the offensive's failure. Yet this professional military consensus never penetrated popular consciousness, where Bastogne remained synonymous with American resistance during the Bulge, while Elsenborn remained unknown to anyone except military historians and the dwindling number of veterans. The Presidential Unit citation awarded to the 2nd Infantry Division for their Bulge performance represented official recognition that meant much to the veterans but reached few others. The citation, issued in 1945, praised the division's outstanding performance of duty in action, and specifically mentioned Elsenborn Ridge as an example of successful defense against superior forces. The citation hung in division headquarters and appeared on veterans' discharge papers, formal acknowledgement that the Army recognized what they'd accomplished. But presidential unit citations don't generate news coverage or public recognition, existing primarily as internal military awards that civilians rarely encounter. The citation provided veterans with official validation of their service, but did nothing to preserve public memory of what they'd achieved. The forgetting of Elsenborn Ridge exemplified a broader pattern in military history, where decisive victories that prevent disasters receive less recognition than desperate last, stands that capture imagination. Bastogne was surrounded, its defenders facing potential annihilation, creating drama that humans instinctively find compelling. Elsenborn was never surrounded. Its defenders fought from prepared positions with adequate support, and their success meant the dramatic potential siege never materialized. The very effectiveness of the Elsenborn defense, the professional competence that prevented disaster, made it less interesting to audiences seeking dramatic narratives. Success that looks routine receives less attention than failure barely averted, a pattern that frustrates military professionals, but which reflects fundamental aspects of how humans construct and remember narratives. January 15th, 1945. The 2nd Infantry Division attacked east from Elsenborn Ridge, transitioning from defense to offense as part of the Allied counteroffensive designed to eliminate the Bulge and drive German forces back across the border. The same soldiers who defended the ridge now advanced through snow and frozen forests. As their roles reversed, but their competence unchanged. They moved through Krinkelt Rocherath, now ruins showing the cost of the defensive battle, and pushed into German territory with the systematic aggression of veterans who understood their business. The attack was one more operation in a campaign that had begun at Normandy and would continue until Germany surrendered. But it carried particular satisfaction because they were attacking ground they had defended at such cost. A sergeant from the 9th Infantry remarked to his squad that they were getting back territory German forces had thought they'd captured, a small revenge that meant more to soldiers than strategic calculations. The drive from Elsenborn to the Royer River consumed 6 weeks of continuous operations. If the division fighting through the same German positions they'd been supposed to attack in December before the Bulge began. The operations were methodical rather than dramatic, experienced soldiers destroying German resistance through overwhelming firepower and tactical competence rather than heroic charges. Villages fell with predictable regularity, the division advancing 2 or 3 miles daily against weakening German resistance. By late February, they'd reached the Roer and prepared to cross, resuming the offensive that had been interrupted by Hitler's gamble. A lieutenant who'd fought at Elsenborn noted that the German soldiers they now captured were noticeably younger and older than those who'd attacked in December, evidence that German manpower was approaching exhaustion. May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. Well, the 2nd Infantry Division occupied positions in Czechoslovakia, having fought continuously from Normandy to Prague across 11 months of war. The division had participated in every major campaign in the European theater: Normandy, Brittany, the drive to the German border, the Battle of the Bulge, the Roer River crossing, and the final drive into Germany. Their battle streamers included 15 named engagements, more than almost any division in the European theater. The cost had been terrible. 16,000 casualties over 11 months, roughly 100% turnover in infantry companies. Losses that meant the division that ended the war shared little personnel continuity with the division that had landed at Normandy. But they'd won every significant engagement, never been forced to retreat strategically, and compiled a combat record that military historians would study for decades. Demobilization in 1945 and 1946 scattered the 2nd Division's veterans across America, men returning to the lives they'd left, or building new lives shaped by what they'd experienced. Most never talked about Elsenborn Ridge except with other veterans, finding that civilians couldn't understand or didn't want the burden of their memories. A corporal who'd fought at Krinkelt Rocherath returned to farming in Kansas, his silver star stored in a drawer where nobody except family would see it. A sergeant who'd called artillery fire from Elsenborn Ridge became a teacher in Ohio, occasionally mentioning his military service, but never describing the 72 hours in the church steeple. The transition from soldier to civilian was awkward for men who'd spent formative years in circumstances where death was commonplace, and most handled it by compartmentalizing their military experience, maintaining it as something separate from their civilian identities. 1950 brought the Korean War and reactivation of the 2nd Infantry Division, this time deploying to Asia rather than Europe. The division carried its Elsenborn Ridge battle streamer to Korea, a piece of cloth representing sacrifice in Belgian snow, now relevant to fighting in Korean hills. Some Korean War-era soldiers learned about Elsenborn Ridge from the division's heritage briefings, understanding they served in a unit with distinguished history, but most treated it as ancient history, as something that had happened to previous generations and which had limited relevance to their current war. The division continued serving after Korea, stationed in Germany during the Cold War, where they occupied positions defending against Soviet forces that never attacked. Elsenborn Ridge remained part of their lineage, referenced in ceremonies and official histories, but fading from active memory as the veterans who'd been there retired or died. The division's current incarnation, now headquartered at Fort Liberty in North Carolina, maintains the Elsenborn Ridge heritage through displays in headquarters buildings and periodic commemorative events. Young soldiers joining the 2nd Infantry Division learn about the battle during their orientation, usually through a brief historical presentation that covers major engagements. And the presentations are factually accurate but necessarily condensed, reducing 3 weeks of combat to bullet points and statistics that capture facts but not experience. A captain giving one such presentation in 2020 described Elsenborn as the northern anchor of the Bulge defense, a phrase that was precise but which provided no sense of what it meant to fight in frozen foxholes under artillery fire. The captain, a professional soldier, understood the limitation but worked within constraints of time and his audience's attention span. Jose Lopez, the Medal of Honor recipient from Elsenborn Ridge, spent his post-war decades as a veterans advocate, using his recognition to speak for soldiers whose heroism had earned less formal acknowledgement. He traveled to schools and veterans organizations, telling stories about Elsenborn Ridge and insisting that his Medal of Honor represented the collective courage of his unit rather than individual achievement. Lopez understood that he'd survived to receive recognition, while friends who'd performed equally courageous actions had died without recognition. And he carried that survivor's burden with the grace that characterized his approach to life. His death in 2005 removed one of the last widely recognized voices speaking about Elsenborn Ridge, though by then he'd influenced a generation of veterans advocates who continued his work. The military lessons from Elsenborn Ridge entered doctrine through analysis conducted in the immediate post-war years and refined over subsequent decades. The battle demonstrated the decisive importance of veteran units in defensive operations, the effectiveness of concentrated artillery when properly employed, and the value of prepared positions defended by competent soldiers. Artillery employment at Elsenborn became a case study taught at Fort Sill, the Army's artillery school, showing how massed fires could destroy attacks before they reached friendly positions. Defensive operations at staff colleges referenced Elsenborn as an example of successful fighting withdrawal followed by static defense. The lessons were technical and professional, reducing human experience to principles that could be taught and applied. But they ensured Elsenborn's military significance would be remembered even as public memory faded. The lives saved calculation, compiled by operations research analysts in the 1950s, estimated that the Elsenborn defense had prevented 10,000 to 15,000 additional Allied casualties by preventing German breakthrough in the north. The calculation was necessarily speculative, based on modeling what would have happened if German forces had accessed the Malmedy-Spa road network and captured the supply depots there. But even conservative estimates suggested the 2nd Division's stand had saved thousands of American and British lives by preventing operational breakthrough and the chaos that would have resulted. These lives saved didn't generate recognition because preventing disaster is invisible, but they represented Elsenborn's most important legacy. Men who came home to families because German forces never reached positions they were attacking toward. The current 2nd Infantry Division shoulder patch, the Indian head insignia, carries no specific reference to Elsenborn Ridge, just as it carries no reference to Normandy or the Rower River or any other specific battle. The patch represents institutional continuity, a symbol connecting current soldiers to those who fought in previous generations. Young soldiers wearing that patch mostly don't know its history in detail, just as soldiers in any long-serving unit mostly don't know the specific actions that created their unit's reputation. But the reputation exists, transmitted through informal channels and institutional culture, creating expectations of professional competence that current soldiers strive to meet. Elsenborn Ridge is part of that reputation, one battle among many that collectively define what it means to serve in the 2nd Infantry Division. The memorial service is held periodically at Elsenborn Ridge, usually organized by Belgian-American friendship organizations, attracts smaller crowds each year as the veteran generation passes. The most recent service, in 2024, included 2 2nd Division veterans of the Bulge, both in their late 90s, who made the journey to Belgium one final time. They stood at monuments marking where they had fought 80 years earlier, remembering friends who died there, and acknowledged that they were probably the last who would visit with personal memory of the battle. A Belgian host thanked them for their service, inadequate words for what they'd given, but the only words available. The veterans accepted the thanks with the grace of old soldiers who'd long since made peace with their memories and their survivor's burden. The legacy of Elsenborn Ridge exists in multiple forms: formal military history that preserves facts, institutional memory that shapes unit culture, individual memory that veterans carry until death, and the negative space of disaster prevented. The last may be most important because it represents Elsenborn's true significance. The battles that didn't happen because German forces never broke through, the casualties that weren't suffered because supplies kept flowing through Liège, the strategic complications that never materialized because the northern shoulder held. These negative achievements are impossible to memorialize because how do you remember what didn't happen? But they represent war's ultimate success. Not victory celebrated, but catastrophe prevented. Not glory achieved, but duty performed. Not fame earned, but brothers brought home. The 2nd Infantry Division accomplished all of this at Elsenborn Ridge, and if history largely forgot their achievement, perhaps that forgetting is itself testament to how completely they succeeded in preventing the disaster that would have made their sacrifice impossible to forget.